The wagon was out of control, two horses wild with terror, a teacher frozen at the reins, and the entire town of Dry Creek watching death barrel toward Main Street. Ethan Cole didn't think. He just moved. What happened next would shatter the walls he'd spent 15 years building around his heart. This is the story of a man who believed love destroyed everything, until a woman proved that fear was the real killer. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. The sun hadn't yet burned the frost off the Montana grasslands when Ethan Cole rode into Dry Creek that October morning in 1883. His gelding, a gray brute named Ash, moved with the tired rhythm of a creature that knew its master's moods, steady, cautious, expecting nothing. Ethan kept his hat low and his eyes lower. The town had doubled in size since spring, spilling awkwardly beyond its original boundaries like a child outgrowing last year's boots. New faces everywhere. New voices. New complications he had no interest in navigating. He'd come for supplies. Coffee, lamp oil, ammunition, essentials that couldn't wait another week. The ranch sat 11 miles north, tucked against the foothills where the land turned rough and the neighbors turned scarce. That's how Ethan liked it. Distance was clarity. Solitude was survival. At 32, he'd perfected the art of being forgettable. Medium height, broad through the shoulders from years of work, face weathered but unremarkable beneath several days of stubble. Brown hair, brown eyes, brown coat. Nothing about Ethan Cole invited conversation, and everything about him discouraged it. He tied Ash outside Brennan's general store and stepped onto the boardwalk, already mentally cataloging his route through town. Get in, get out, speak to no one who didn't absolutely require it. But Dry Creek had other plans. Ethan Cole, as I live and breathe. He closed his eyes briefly, recognizing the voice before he turned. Samuel Hewitt, the town's self-appointed mayor and relentless optimist, was striding toward him with the kind of aggressive friendliness that made Ethan's jaw tighten. Sam, been months since we've seen you in town. How's that ranch holding up? Cattle looking good? You thinking about the winter feed situation? Because I've been talking to some of the other ranchers about bulk purchasing, and I think if we... Ranch is fine. Ethan kept his voice flat, his body angled toward the store. Just here for supplies. Sam either missed the dismissal or ignored it. Well, before you disappear back into those hills, you should know there's been some talk about expanding the grazing allotments. Territorial office is sending someone to... A shout cut through Sam's monologue. Then a scream. Then the unmistakable thunder of hooves moving too fast, iron shoes striking packed earth in panicked staccato. Ethan turned toward the sound, his body responding before his mind caught up. At the far end of Main Street, a wagon had broken loose from its moorings outside the livery stable. Two draft horses, spooked by something Ethan couldn't see, were charging straight down the center of town, the wagon fishtailing wildly behind them. People scattered. A woman snatched her child off the street. Old Porter dove behind a water trough. The horses weren't slowing. If anything, their terror was accelerating, feeding on itself, turning animal panic into lethal momentum. And there, fighting the reins with everything she had, was a woman Ethan had never seen before. She wasn't screaming, wasn't freezing. Her hands worked the leather with fierce determination, her body braced against the wagon seat, her dark hair coming loose from its pins as she fought for control. But the horses were beyond reason, and the wagon was seconds from careening into the crowd gathering outside the church. Ethan was moving before the thought fully formed. He vaulted off the boardwalk and into the street, his boots hitting dirt as the wagon bore down on him. 50 feet, 40. He could see the whites of the horses' eyes now, see the foam at their bits, see the wagon's front wheel wobbling dangerously on its axle. 20 feet. Ethan stepped directly into their path and raised both arms. Hey! His voice cut through the chaos like a blade, sharp and absolute. The lead horse's ears flicked forward, just for a second, just enough, and Ethan lunged, catching the bridle strap and yanking down with all his weight. The horse reared, screaming, its massive head jerking sideways. Ethan held on, his boots skidding in the dirt as half a ton of terrified animal tried to shake him loose. The second horse crashed into the first, their traces tangling, and the wagon slewed violently to the left. For one terrible moment, Ethan thought it would flip, thought he'd misjudged everything, thought he was about to be crushed beneath wheels and hooves and his own goddamn recklessness. Then the woman on the wagon seat threw her entire body weight backward, hauling the reins with a strength that shouldn't have existed in her frame, and the horses stumbled to a halt 6 feet from the church steps. Silence dropped over Main Street like a curtain. Ethan stood in the dust, still gripping the bridle, his heart slamming against his ribs. The lead horse was trembling, sides heaving, but the panic was draining out of it now, replaced by exhausted confusion. He gentled his grip, murmuring low, wordless sounds, and felt the animal's head drop slightly. Behind him, the town was coming back to life. Voices rising, people rushing forward, Sam's excited babbling about heroics and quick thinking. Ethan ignored all of it. He was looking at the woman on the wagon seat. She was still holding the reins, her knuckles white, her breath coming hard. Mid-20s, he guessed. Dark hair, sharp features, a face that wouldn't be called pretty in the conventional sense but held something better. Intelligence, clarity, an unsettling directness. Her dress was simple, practical, gray wool that had seen wear. No jewelry, no pretense. And she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite parse. Not gratitude, not shock. Something closer to assessment. You could have been killed. Her voice was steady. East Coast educated, touched with something that might have been Boston or Philadelphia. Not a trace of hysteria. Ethan released the horse and stepped back, suddenly aware of how many people were watching. Could have. Wasn't. That was either very brave or very stupid. Probably stupid. He turned away, dusting off his hands, already regretting the attention, already feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on his back, already wanting to be 11 miles north, where nobody asked questions or expected conversation. But Sam was there, clapping him on the shoulder with enough force to make Ethan wince. "Ethan Cole, you just saved Miss Hale's life. Margaret, this is the man I was telling you about. Owns the Cole Ranch up north. Keeps to himself mostly, but clearly he's got the kind of quick thinking we need around here." Margaret Hale, the new schoolteacher. Ethan had heard talk of her arrival last month, some educated woman from back east who'd taken the position when the previous teacher married and moved to Helena. The town had been buzzing about it for weeks, curious and skeptical in equal measure. She was climbing down from the wagon now, moving carefully, testing her legs. When she reached the ground, she smoothed her skirts and looked at Ethan directly. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." That was remarkably selfless. There was something in the way she said it, not quite sincere. Or maybe too sincere, like she was testing the weight of the words, measuring them against some internal standard. "Just stop some horses." Ethan tugged his hat lower. "Glad you're all right, ma'am." He turned to go. "Mr. Cole." He paused, not looking back. The brake line was cut. This wasn't an accident. That stopped him. Ethan turned slowly, studying her face for signs of hysteria or exaggeration. Found neither. Margaret Hale met his gaze evenly, her hands folded in front of her, her expression calm and certain. "I checked the wagon myself this morning. The line was intact. Someone tampered with it between then and now." "That's a serious accusation, Miss Hale." Sam's jovial tone had vanished, replaced by something harder. "You sure about that?" "Quite sure." She nodded toward the wagon. "You can examine it yourself if you'd like. The cut is clean, deliberate." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Ethan saw faces turning, suspicious glances exchanged, the easy camaraderie of moments ago curdling into something uglier. "Now hold on," Sam said, raising his hands. "Let's not jump to conclusions. Could have been wear and tear, could have been—" It was cut. Margaret's voice didn't rise, but it cut through Sam's placating like a knife. "I don't know by whom or why, but I know what I saw." Ethan found himself walking toward the wagon, despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, to get his supplies and ride north and forget this woman existed. But something in her voice, that absolute certainty, that refusal to soften the truth, hooked him. He knelt beside the wagon's undercarriage, examining the brake mechanism. The crowd pressed closer, curious and uncomfortable. Sam hovered, making worried noises about misunderstandings and new equipment. But Margaret was right. The line had been cut, not sawed through gradually, but sliced cleanly with a blade. Recently, too, the leather was still fresh where it had parted. Ethan stood, wiping his hands on his thighs. She's right. Someone did this. The murmur turned into an uproar. Who
This
would do
story
such a
was
thing?
posted on the
That's
channel
attempted
west
murder.
of Betrayal.
We need
Please
to
do
call
not
the sheriff.
repost it in any
The
form.
sheriff's in Helena for the week, dealing with that land dispute. Then we form a committee. We find out who's responsible. Ethan felt the situation spiraling, felt the town's fear and outrage building towards something stupid and dangerous. He'd seen it before. Good people turning into a mob because someone needed to be blamed, and anyone would do. He looked at Margaret Hale. She was watching the crowd with that same calm assessment, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands had tightened on her skirts. She knew what was coming. Knew that being new, being educated, being from the East made her suspect by default. Knew that in a town like Dry Creek, different was dangerous. Enough! Ethan's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like cold water. Standing here shouting solves nothing. Miss Hale needs to get somewhere safe. The wagon needs to be secured. And whoever did this needs to know they failed. Sam blinked at him. Ethan, are you suggesting... I'm suggesting we handle this smart instead of stupid. Ethan turned to Margaret. You have somewhere to stay? The boarding house. Mrs. Chen's place. Good. Go there. Don't go anywhere alone until this is sorted out. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with those sharp, dark eyes. And you? I'm getting my supplies and going home. Of course you are. There was something almost amused in her tone, but also disappointed. Like she'd expected better and wasn't surprised to be proven wrong. It stung more than it should have. Ethan tipped his hat, stepped back, and walked toward Brennan's store. Behind him, the crowd was still arguing. Sam was organizing some kind of investigation committee, and Margaret Hale was being escorted toward the boarding house by a cluster of concerned citizens. He'd done enough. More than enough. He'd saved her life, confirmed her story, and now he was done. That's what he told himself as he gathered his supplies with mechanical efficiency, paid without meeting anyone's eyes, and loaded everything onto Ash's saddle. That's what he kept telling himself as he rode north, leaving Dry Creek and its complications behind. But 3 days later, Ethan Cole did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He went back. The excuse was simple enough. He'd forgotten to order wire for fence repairs, needed to check on a delivery at the rail depot. Practical reasons. Nothing to do with a school teacher with dark eyes and a voice that didn't know how to lie. Except Ethan had never forgotten an order in his life, and the fence repairs could wait until spring. He rode into town just after noon on a Thursday, when the school would be in session and the streets relatively quiet. Tied Ash outside Brennan's again. Collected his wire. And then, instead of leaving, found himself walking toward the small white building at the edge of town where a hand-painted sign read, Dry Creek Schoolhouse. The sound of children's voices drifted through the open windows, recitation, rhythmic and careful. Ethan stood outside like an idiot, trying to figure out what the hell he was doing here. Mr. Cole. He turned. Margaret Hale was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, her expression unreadable. She wore a different dress today, dark blue, equally practical, and her hair was pinned back severely, though a few strands had already escaped. Miss Hale, are you lost? No, ma'am. Then you're here intentionally, which is somehow more concerning. But there was a hint of something in her voice. Not quite humor, but close. Ethan cleared his throat. Came to check if there'd been any more trouble. There hasn't, though I appreciate the concern. She paused. Would you like to come in? The children are practicing their multiplication tables. It's monumentally boring, but relatively safe. He should say no. Should tip his hat, walk away, ride north, and never come back. All right. Margaret stepped aside, and Ethan entered the schoolhouse for the first time since he was 12 years old. It smelled like chalk and paper, and the particular mustiness of old books. 20 children sat at rough-hewn desks, ranging from perhaps 6 to 14, all dressed in hand-me-downs and hope. They turned to stare at the stranger, their recitation faltering. This is Mr. Cole, Margaret said calmly. He's visiting today. Continue, please. 7 times 8? 56, a small girl in the front row called out. Excellent, Mary. 8 times 8? Ethan stood awkwardly near the door while Margaret guided her students through their lesson with quiet efficiency. No drama, no performance, just steady, patient instruction that assumed competence and demanded effort in equal measure. She was good at this, he realized, not just competent, but genuinely skilled. The children responded to her, not out of fear but respect. After perhaps 20 minutes, Margaret dismissed the class for afternoon recess. The children exploded toward the door with the contained chaos of youth, and suddenly Ethan was alone with her in the empty schoolhouse. "So," Margaret said, moving to straighten the desks, "you didn't really come to check on me." "I did. But that's not the only reason." Ethan said nothing. Margaret looked at him directly, and there it was again, that unsettling clarity, like she could see past his defenses to the truth he wasn't ready to admit. "You're curious," she said. It wasn't a question. "Maybe." "About?" "Why you're here, in Dry Creek. A woman with your education could teach anywhere." "And you assume I'm here because I had no other choice." "Most people come to the frontier because they're running from something, or towards something they can't find anywhere else." Margaret smiled, small, sharp, humorless. "And which are you, Mr. Cole? Running from or toward?" The question hit harder than she probably intended. Ethan felt his shoulders tighten, his defenses rising. "That's personal." "So is why I'm here." "Fair point." They stood in the afternoon light, dust motes drifting between them, and Ethan felt something shift. Some recognition that this woman was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with cut brake lines or frontier violence. She saw too much, questioned too directly, refused to accept the comfortable lies people told themselves. "I should go," Ethan said. "You should," Margaret agreed. "But you won't. Not yet." "Why do you say that?" "Because you're still trying to figure out if I'm worth the risk." The words landed like a punch. Ethan stared at her, caught between denial and a truth so uncomfortable it made his chest tight. "Risk of what?" Margaret picked up a piece of chalk, turned to the blackboard, and wrote a single word in neat, precise script. "Everything." Then she set the chalk down, dusted her hands, and looked at him with something that might have been pity or understanding or both. "I'm not fragile, Mr. Cole. I'm not looking for rescue. I'm not some romantic notion of frontier womanhood waiting to civilize a rough man's heart." She crossed her arms. "I'm here because I choose to be. Because I believe education matters more than comfort. Because I'd rather live according to my principles than die slowly in someone else's parlor." That's a hell of a speech. It's the truth, which is more than most people in this town seem capable of. Ethan felt something crack open inside him, some sealed place he'd kept locked for so long he'd forgotten it existed. This woman wasn't what he expected, wasn't what he wanted, wasn't safe. And that terrified him more than any runaway wagon ever could. "I'll check on you next week," he heard himself say. "Why?" "Because someone cut your brake line and nobody's figured out who." "That's not why." No, it wasn't. Margaret held his gaze, waiting, and Ethan realized she wasn't going to let him hide. Wasn't going to accept half-truths or comfortable evasions. If he was going to do this, whatever this was, she demanded honesty. "Because I want to," he said finally. Raw, simple, true. "Then come back," Margaret said. "But don't come back because you think I need saving. Come back because you're brave enough to risk being seen." Ethan left without another word, but he came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that, always with an excuse, always with some practical reason that made sense on the surface. He was checking on the schoolhouse roof, delivering wood for the stove, asking about organizing a winter education program for the ranch families. Margaret never called him on the lies, just met him with that same sharp assessment, that same refusal to accept anything less than honesty. And slowly, against every instinct screaming at him to stop, Ethan began to talk. Not about the important things, not yet, but small truths, observations about the land, stories about difficult cattle, opinions about the territorial government's incompetence. Margaret listened with the same focused attention she gave her students, asking questions that made him think harder than he'd thought in years. She talked too. about her childhood in Philadelphia, her frustration with society's expectations,
This story was
her belief
posted
that
on the
education
channel
could
west of
transform
Betrayal.
lives if
Please
people
do
were
not
brave enough to
repost it
invest
in
in
any
it.
form.
She spoke about ideas the way Ethan spoke about land, with passion, specificity, practical knowledge earned through experience. They were careful not to touch, careful to maintain proper distance, careful to ensure no one in town could claim impropriety. But something was growing between them, something neither of them named but both recognized. It was Margaret who finally said it out loud. "You're afraid of me." They were walking along the creek one November afternoon, the cottonwoods bare and silver in the fading light. Ethan had brought his horse, ostensibly to check some property markers, and Margaret had joined him after school. Proper. Visible, nothing hidden. "That's a bold claim," Ethan said. "It's true. You're terrified. I can see it every time you look at me." "Maybe I just prefer being alone." "No." Margaret stopped walking, turned to face him. "You don't prefer it. You've convinced yourself it's safer. There's a difference." Ethan wanted to deny it, wanted to build the wall back up, retreat to his ranch, forget this woman existed. But he was so goddamn tired of lying. "I'm afraid," he said quietly. "Terrified, actually." "Of what?" "Of wanting something I can't protect. Of caring about someone and having them destroyed because of it." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Who did you lose?" And there it was. The question he'd been avoiding for 15 years. Ethan looked at the creek, the water running cold and clear over ancient stone. "My mother, sister, father, eventually, though that took longer." He swallowed hard. "Scarlet fever. I was 17. Watched them die over the course of 3 weeks. Nothing I could do. Nothing anyone could do. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Doesn't change anything." "No," Margaret agreed. "It doesn't. But using their deaths as an excuse to stop living doesn't honor them either." Ethan's head snapped around. "That's not what I'm doing." "Isn't it? You've spent 15 years hiding on a ranch, convincing yourself that isolation is strength, that caring is weakness, that loving someone means inviting destruction." She stepped closer. "But all you've really done is ensure that when you die, you'll do it alone, having protected nothing, having risked nothing, having lived nothing." The words hit like bullets. Ethan felt his chest tighten, felt anger and grief and something deeper rising up. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Margaret's voice was steady, relentless. "I understand that you're choosing fear over life, safety over meaning, and I understand that if you continue down this path, you'll wake up one day and realize you've wasted decades protecting a heart that stopped beating the day your family died." Ethan turned away, his hands shaking. "Why do you care? You barely know me." "Because I see you, Ethan. I see who you are beneath the fear, and I refuse to watch another intelligent person destroy themselves with lies." He stood there, shaking, 15 years of carefully constructed defenses crumbling around him. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd built, everything he'd told himself about survival and solitude, all of it suddenly felt hollow. "What do you want from me?" His voice came out raw, broken. "I want you to choose, deliberately, honestly." Margaret moved to stand beside him, not touching, just present. "I want you to stop hiding behind practicality and admit that you're lonely, that you want connection, that you're capable of more than just surviving. And if I do, if I admit all that," Ethan looked at her, "what then? Then we see what happens. Together. Without guarantees, without certainty. With nothing but the courage to try." Ethan closed his eyes, breathed, felt the November wind cutting through his coat and the weight of 15 years pressing on his shoulders. "I don't know how," he whispered. "Yes, you do. You've been doing it for weeks." Margaret's hand brushed his, barely, just a moment of contact. "You came back. That's how it starts." They stood together as the sun dropped toward the mountains and the temperature fell and the world turned cold and beautiful and terrifyingly uncertain. And for the first time in 15 years, Ethan Cole allowed himself to hope. 3 weeks later, Martin Gaines made his move. Gaines owned the largest spread in the county, 10,000 acres of prime grazing land and the political connections to expand it. He was loud, ambitious, and had made no secret of his interest in Margaret Hale since her arrival. That interest had turned ugly when she rejected his advances. Ethan first heard about it from Sam Hewitt, who cornered him at Brennan's store with the kind of gossip that pretended to be concern. "Just thought you should know," Sam said, lowering his voice. "Gaines has been telling anyone who'll listen that Miss Hale is, well, that she's not as respectable as she appears, that she's been entertaining men at the boarding house, that her intentions here aren't purely educational." Ethan's hand stilled on the bag of coffee he was loading. "That's a damn lie. Course it is, but you know how talk spreads, and Gaines, well, he's got influence. People listen to him." "What does he want?" "What he's always wanted. Control. He figures if he can damage her reputation enough, she'll have to leave or accept his protection. Either way, he wins." Ethan felt something cold and furious settling in his chest. "Where is she now?" "School, probably. But Ethan, you need to be careful. Gaines has been watching. If you—" Ethan was already moving. He found Margaret at the schoolhouse, washing the blackboard after dismissing her students. She turned when he entered, saw his expression, and straightened. "What happened?" "Gaines is spreading lies about you, trying to destroy your reputation." "I know." That stopped him. "You know. 3 families pulled their children from school this week. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street to avoid speaking to me yesterday, and someone left a rather vile note under my door at the boarding house." Margaret set down her cloth, her movements precise and controlled. "I'm not blind, Ethan." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because there's nothing you can do. Because getting involved will only make it worse. Because—" She paused. "Because I need to fight this battle myself." "That's bullshit. It's practical. It's fear." Margaret's eyes flashed. "Don't use my own words against me." "Then don't lie to me." Ethan crossed the room, stopping a few feet away. "You said I was choosing fear over life. You were right, but you're doing the same thing now. You're isolating yourself because you think it's safer than accepting help. This is different. It's not. Gaines is trying to force you out because he can't control you, because you threaten everything he believes about how women should behave, about who gets to have power in this town. And if you let him win by staying silent, by fighting alone, you prove him right." Margaret stared at him, something shifting in her expression. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we stop pretending, stop being careful, stop giving a damn about what people think." Ethan moved closer. "I'm suggesting you let me stand beside you, publicly, deliberately, so everyone in this town knows that if they come for you, they come for both of us. That will destroy your reputation too." "I don't care." "Ethan, I don't care," he repeated, and meant it. "Let them talk. Let Gaines spin whatever lies he wants. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending I don't care. I'm done choosing safety over the only thing that's made me feel alive in 15 goddamn years." Margaret's breath caught. "You're sure?" "Terrified, but sure." She studied his face for a long moment, and Ethan saw her making the same calculation he had, weighing risk against reward, fear against possibility, isolation against connection. "All right," she said finally. "Then here's what we're going to do." They walked into the town meeting together that Saturday night. The room went silent. Ethan had dressed carefully, clean shirt, vest, his good coat. Margaret wore a simple dark dress, her hair pinned back, her spine straight. They entered through the main door, visible to everyone, and took seats in the 3rd row. Together. The whispers started immediately. Heads turning, shocked expressions. Martin Gaines, standing near the front, went red with fury. Sam Hewitt was attempting to call the meeting to order, discussing water rights or some other routine business, but nobody was listening. The entire room was focused on Ethan and Margaret, trying to parse what their presence together meant. Gaines decided to make it explicit. "Before we begin," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Or should I say, the school teacher." "Martin," Sam tried to interrupt. "No, Sam. This needs to be said." Gaines turned to face the crowd. "We brought Miss Hale here to educate our children, to provide moral guidance. But it seems she's been providing other kinds of guidance as well, to certain unmarried men, in private. The room erupted. Ethan started to stand, but Margaret's hand on his arm stopped
This
him.
story was posted
"Let
on the
me,"
channel west
she
of
said
Betrayal.
quietly.
Please
She
do not
rose and the
repost
room
it in any
gradually
form.
quieted, everyone watching to see what the accused schoolteacher would say. "Mr. Gaines is correct," Margaret said, her voice calm and clear. "I have been spending time with Mr. Cole, in public, during daylight hours, with absolutely nothing to hide." Gaines sneered. "That's not what I've heard." "Then you've heard lies." Margaret didn't raise her voice, but somehow it filled the room anyway. "Which you've been spreading deliberately because I refused your advances. Because I dared to suggest that owning land doesn't entitle you to own people. Because I represent everything you fear, a woman who thinks for herself and refuses to be controlled. That's slander. It's truth, which is why you're so desperate to destroy me before anyone else realizes it." The room was utterly silent now. Ethan watched faces changing, people reconsidering, the narrative Gaines had been building starting to crack. "Furthermore," Margaret continued, "Mr. Cole and I are courting, openly, with honorable intentions. If that offends anyone's sensibilities, I invite them to explain exactly which principle we're violating. I'm an unmarried woman. He's an unmarried man. We're both adults. We've been entirely proper in our conduct. So please," she looked directly at Gaines, "tell me what rule we've broken besides your belief that you have any say in my choices." Gaines opened his mouth, closed it. His face cycled through several shades of red. "That's what I thought," Margaret said. She turned to address the room. "I came to Dry Creek to teach, to educate children regardless of their background or circumstances, to prepare them for a world that will demand more than what this town currently offers. If my presence here offends anyone, if my relationship with Mr. Cole makes me unsuitable, then I invite the community to vote. Right now, publicly. Should I stay or should I go?" The silence stretched out, taut and fragile. Then a voice from the back spoke up. Mary Henderson, a rancher's wife whose daughter was Margaret's best student. "I vote she stays." Another voice. "I vote stay." Then another, and another. Not everyone. Some remained silent, uncertain, swayed by Gaines's influence or their own prejudices. But enough. More than enough. Sam, looking relieved, called for a formal count. 43 to stay, 19 to leave, 8 abstentions. Margaret had won. Gaines stormed out, making threats about territorial authorities and proper conduct. His supporters followed. But the majority remained, and as the meeting resumed, Ethan felt something fundamental shift. He'd chosen, publicly, irrevocably. He'd stood beside Margaret Hale in front of the entire town and declared himself without equivocation. And instead of destroying him, it felt like freedom. After the meeting, they walked back to the boarding house in the cold November night. Neither spoke until they reached the front steps. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "For what?" "For being brave enough to stand with me. For choosing risk over safety." She looked up at him, and in the lamplight spilling from the window, Ethan saw something he'd never expected to see again. Hope. "I meant what I said in there," he told her, "about courting, about honorable intentions. I know. I'm not easy, Margaret. I'm stubborn and solitary, and I don't know how to—" "Ethan." She put her hand on his chest, directly over his heart. "I don't need easy. I need honest. I need someone who sees the world clearly and chooses to engage with it anyway. I need someone who's willing to be changed by love instead of destroyed by fear. Can I be that person?" "You already are." He kissed her then, careful and certain, and felt 15 years of armor finally fall away. When they parted, Margaret smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded. "So," she said, "what happens now?" Ethan looked at this woman who'd shattered every belief he'd held about survival and safety and solitude, who'd demanded honesty when it would have been easier to accept lies, who'd seen him at his most broken and called him toward something better. "Now," he said, "we figure it out, together." And that's exactly what they did. Winter came hard that year, dropping temperatures low enough to freeze the creek solid by mid-December. Ethan found himself making the ride into Dry Creek more often than he'd ever intended. always with some excuse that fooled no one, least of all himself. He'd check on Margaret between her teaching hours, bring firewood for the schoolhouse stove, linger over conversations that stretched longer each time. They were careful still. Proper. Margaret had won her battle at the town meeting, but both of them understood how fragile public opinion could be. Small towns had long memories and sharp teeth, so they courted in full view, walks along Main Street, Sunday dinners at the boarding house with Mrs. Chen as chaperone, conversations on the schoolhouse steps where anyone passing could see them. But the careful distance was wearing on Ethan, not because he wanted impropriety, but because every moment with Margaret made him want more time, more honesty, more of whatever this thing between them was becoming. She challenged him constantly, never letting him retreat into comfortable silence, always pushing him to articulate thoughts he'd kept buried for years. "You're doing it again," she said one afternoon in late December. They were sitting on a bench outside Brennan's store, ostensibly watching the town prepare for Christmas, but really just existing in each other's presence. "Doing what?" "Retreating into your head. I can see it happening. You get this look, like you're calculating distances and exits." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe I'm just thinking. About how to leave? That's not fair." "It's accurate." Margaret pulled her shawl tighter against the wind. "Every time we get close to something real, something vulnerable, you start planning your escape route. You're doing it right now." She was right, and they both knew it. Ethan had been thinking about the ranch, about the cattle he needed to check on, about whether he could justify staying in town another hour or whether he should ride out before the weather turned worse. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "How to be present. How to stop treating every conversation like it might be the last one. Then stop trying to control the outcome. Just be here. With me. Right now." Margaret looked at him with those sharp, dark eyes that never let him hide. "Can you do that? Can you just sit here without planning 3 moves ahead?" Ethan took a breath, released it, made himself focus on the immediate present, the cold air on his face, the sound of children playing in the snow across the street, Margaret's shoulder barely touching his through layers of winter clothing. "I'm scared," he said, raw and simple. "I know. Of losing you, of getting too close, and then having everything taken away again. I know that too." Margaret's hand found his, hidden between their bodies where casual observers wouldn't see. "But Ethan, you're so focused on potential loss that you're missing what we already have, this moment, this conversation, the fact that you're here at all. Is it enough? Just moments? It's everything. Moments are all anyone ever has." They sat in silence for a while, and Ethan tried to practice what she was teaching him, being present, accepting uncertainty, letting go of the desperate need to control outcomes. It felt like learning to walk again. Every instinct screamed at him to pull back, to protect himself, to maintain distance. But Margaret's hand was warm in his, and she wasn't asking him to be perfect, just honest. "I'm glad you're here," he said finally. "Good. So am I." It was enough. For now. The trouble started again in January, though it came from a different direction this time. Ethan was at the rail depot collecting a shipment of supplies when he overheard 2 men talking near the loading platform. He didn't recognize them, probably drifters or hired hands from one of the larger ranches, but their conversation stopped him cold. "Heard there's good money in it. 300 head, maybe more. Just sitting out there waiting. Cole's place? That's asking for trouble. Man's got a reputation. Man's got a woman now, spending all his time in town instead of watching his stock. Makes him soft. Makes him vulnerable." Ethan stepped around the corner, his movements deliberate. Both men went silent, their eyes widening slightly when they saw him. "You were saying?" His voice was quiet, dangerous. The first man, younger and clearly stupider, tried to bluff. "Just talking, friend. No harm meant." "I'm not your friend, and you're talking about rustling my cattle." "Now hold on. No." Ethan moved closer, keeping his voice low enough that no one else at the depot could hear. "You hold on. I know exactly what you're planning, and I know who sent you. Martin Gaines wants to hit my ranch while I'm distracted, make me look weak, maybe force me to sell out cheap. But here's what's going to happen instead. You're going to ride back to Gaines and tell him that if one head of my stock goes missing, I'll know exactly where it went, and I won't go to the sheriff. I'll come for him directly. Understood?" The second man, older and smarter, grabbed his companion's
This
arm.
story was posted on the channel
"Understood.
west
We were
of
just talking,
Betrayal.
Cole.
Please do not
Nothing more.
repost it in any
See
form.
that it stays that way." They left quickly, and Ethan stood in the cold January air feeling something dark and familiar settling over him. This was what he'd feared. This was why isolation had felt safer. The moment you cared about something, the moment you let people see what mattered to you, they found ways to use it against you. He should have expected it. Should have known that Gaines wouldn't forget his humiliation at the town meeting. Should have realized that showing weakness, showing love, would make him a target. The smart thing would be to pull back. Stop courting Margaret so publicly. Return to the ranch full-time, watch his stock, protect what was his through vigilance and distance. But even as the thought formed, Ethan knew he wouldn't do it, couldn't do it, because pulling back now would mean proving Gaines right, would mean admitting that love was a liability, that caring made you vulnerable, that the only safety was solitude. And Margaret had taught him better than that. He found her at the schoolhouse, dismissing her students for the day. She took one look at his face and sent the last straggling children home with gentle firmness. "What happened?" Ethan told her. All of it. The conversation at the depot, Gaines's probable involvement, the threat hanging over everything they'd built. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing harder with each detail. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He's trying to force you to choose," she said finally. "Between me and the ranch, between what you want and what you think you need to survive. He's trying to prove that caring about you makes me weak. Does it?" "No." Ethan said it without hesitation. "It makes me terrified, but not weak." "Then what are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? Ethan walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street, the mountains beyond, the vast territory he'd chosen 15 years ago because it promised isolation and safety. "I'm going to go home," he said slowly. "Check on the ranch. Make sure the stock is secure. Hire some temporary help if I need to." He turned to face Margaret. "And then I'm going to come back, because I'm not letting Gaines dictate my choices. I'm not letting fear win." "How long will you be gone?" "A week, maybe 2. Margaret nodded, but he saw something flash across her face. Worry, quickly controlled. She was scared too, he realized. Scared that he'd leave and not come back. Scared that distance would give him an excuse to retreat. "Margaret?" He crossed the room, took her hands. "I'm coming back." "You can't promise that. Anything could happen." "I'm coming back," he repeated more firmly. "Not because I have to, because I choose to. Because you've taught me that running from fear doesn't make you safe. It just makes you alone." She searched his face, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because some of the tension left her shoulders. 2 weeks, she said. "If you're not back in 2 weeks, I'm coming to find you." "That's a long ride in winter." "Then you'd better come back." He almost kissed her then, but they were still visible through the schoolhouse windows, still subject to the town's watchful eyes. So instead, he squeezed her hands once, released them, and stepped back. 2 weeks, he promised. The ride back to the ranch was brutal. A storm had blown in overnight, dropping 6 inches of snow and turning the trail into a treacherous maze of hidden ice and drifts. Ash struggled through it gamely, but by the time they reached the ranch house, both horse and rider were exhausted. Ethan spent the next 3 days checking stock, repairing fence lines damaged by the storm, and generally ensuring that his cattle were accounted for and secure. Nothing seemed amiss. No signs of rustling attempts. No evidence that Gaines's men had made good on their implied threats. But the conversation at the depot haunted him. Not because he feared the physical threat. Ethan could handle rustlers if they came, but because it forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. His ranch wasn't enough anymore. For 15 years, it had been everything. His purpose, his protection, his reason for existing. The land had given him a sense of control in a world that had taken everything else. But now, riding the fence lines alone, checking cattle in the bitter cold, returning each night to an empty house, it felt hollow. He missed Margaret. Missed her sharp observations and her refusal to accept easy answers. Missed the way she pushed him to articulate thoughts he barely knew he had. missed the simple presence of another person who saw him clearly and chose him anyway. And that realization was terrifying in its own right. Because if the ranch wasn't enough anymore, if solitude had stopped being sufficient, then he'd have to rebuild his entire understanding of what survival meant. On the fourth day, Ethan was riding the north pasture when he found the calf. It was a late birth, probably from the heifer he'd been watching last fall. The mother was standing over it protectively, but even from a distance, Ethan could see something was wrong. The calf wasn't moving right, wasn't trying to stand. He approached slowly, speaking low to calm the anxious mother. When he got close enough to examine the newborn, his heart sank. The calf's front leg was malformed, twisted at an angle that would never heal properly. It couldn't stand, couldn't nurse, couldn't survive. The practical thing, the thing Ethan had done a dozen times before, was to put the animal down quickly, end its suffering, accept the loss and move on. But his hand hesitated on his rifle. He thought about Margaret, about her insistence that choosing life over safety mattered, about how she'd called him out for protecting a heart that had stopped beating, about how she'd demanded he engage with the world instead of hiding from it. This calf was going to die. There was no saving it, no magical intervention that would straighten that leg or give it a fighting chance. But maybe how he chose to engage with that death mattered. Ethan dismounted, gathered the calf carefully, and carried it to the barn. He made a space in the corner, laid the newborn down on fresh straw, and sat with it as the life slowly left its body. He didn't look away, didn't distance himself, just bore witness to the end, acknowledging the loss instead of treating it like just another necessary task. When it was over, he buried the calf properly, marked the spot, and only then allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened. It was a small thing, a single animal that would never have survived anyway. But somehow it felt significant, like practice for a larger lesson he was still learning, that you could acknowledge loss without being destroyed by it, that you could care about something fully, even knowing it wouldn't last. That presence mattered more than protection. Margaret would understand, he thought. She'd see what he was trying to learn, even if he couldn't quite articulate it yet. He rode back to the house as the sun set, feeling exhausted and raw and strangely at peace. On the sixth day, the weather turned worse. Another storm rolled in from the north, this one meaner than the last. The temperature dropped below zero, wind screaming across the open country with enough force to knock a man off his feet. Ethan secured the barn, brought the horses inside, and settled in to wait it out. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of howling wind and snow so thick he couldn't see the barn from the house windows. 3 days of checking and rechecking supplies, keeping the fire going, making sure the livestock had enough shelter to survive. And 3 days of absolute isolation that nearly broke him. Because for the first time in 15 years, solitude didn't feel like safety. It felt like prison. Ethan found himself pacing the small cabin, unable to settle. He tried reading, but couldn't focus. Tried working on equipment repairs, but his hands were too restless. Tried sleeping, but his mind wouldn't quiet. All he could think about was Margaret, whether she was safe in the boarding house, whether the schoolhouse roof was holding against the storm, whether she was worried about him, whether she thought he'd decided not to come back. The not knowing was agony. The inability to get word to her, to reassure her, to simply exist in her presence, it made him understand viscerally what she'd been trying to teach him all along. Connection wasn't a weakness to be managed. It was a fundamental human need. And trying to live without it didn't make you strong. It just made you slowly die inside. On the third day, when the storm finally broke and weak sunlight filtered through the dissipating clouds, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't stay here. Not long term. Not anymore. The ranch had served its purpose, had given him a place to heal, to rebuild, to learn self-sufficiency. But it had also become a cage, a place where he could hide from everything that made life difficult and complicated and worth living. Margaret was right. He'd been choosing safety over meaning, survival over life. It was time to choose differently. Ethan spent the next 2 days preparing. He couldn't abandon the ranch entirely. It was still his livelihood, his investment, his responsibility. But he could adapt, could hire someone to handle the day-to-day operations, could build his life around something other than isolation, could choose to live in town, with Margaret, if she'd have him. The thought terrified him, meant giving up control, meant trusting others, meant exposing himself to all the complications and vulnerabilities he'd spent 15 years avoiding. But it also meant not dying alone in an empty cabin, having protected nothing and risked nothing and lived nothing.
This
It
story
was
was
2 days
posted
past
on
the
the
2-week
channel
deadline
west of
when he finally
Betrayal.
rode back into
Please
Dry
do not
Creek.
repost it
The
in
town
any
looked
form.
different somehow, smaller, more welcoming, less threatening. Or maybe Ethan was different. Maybe after weeks of being alone with his thoughts and his fears, he'd finally understood what Margaret had been trying to show him. That home wasn't a place you defended, it was a choice you made. He found Margaret at the schoolhouse, teaching her afternoon class. Through the window, he could see her at the blackboard, explaining something with focused intensity, her students leaning forward in their seats. Ethan tied Ash to the post and waited. 20 minutes later, the children burst out for recess, barely noticing the strange man standing in the cold. Margaret appeared in the doorway, scanning the yard automatically, and then she saw him. Her expression cycled through relief, anger, joy, and something deeper he couldn't quite name. She descended the steps carefully, walking toward him with measured control, and when she got close enough, she hit him in the shoulder. Hard. "You're 4 days late." "I know. I was about to saddle a horse and come find you." "I know that too. I thought," her voice cracked slightly, "I thought maybe you'd decided." "No." Ethan caught her hand before she could hit him again. "No, Margaret. I didn't decide anything except to come back. The storm delayed me and I needed time to think, but I was always coming back. You should have sent word." "Couldn't. Storm was too bad." He held her hand between both of his. "But you're right. I should have found a way. Should have known you'd be worried. Should have—" "Stop." Margaret took a breath, visibly controlling herself. "You're here now. That's what matters. I have something to ask you. If you're about to propose while I'm still angry at you for being late, your timing is terrible." Despite everything, Ethan smiled. "Not proposing. Not yet. But asking if you'd be willing to consider a future where I'm not living 11 miles away, where I'm here, in town, building a life that includes more than just cattle and solitude." Margaret went very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you were right about all of it. I've been choosing fear over life, safety over meaning. I've been so focused on protecting myself from loss that I've been losing everything that matters day by day." He squeezed her hand. "The ranch isn't enough anymore. Isolation isn't strength, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life alone just because I'm too scared to risk caring about something." "You'd leave the ranch?" "I'd adapt it, hire help, spend less time there and more time here. More time with you, if you'll have me." Margaret's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "That's a significant change, Ethan. Are you sure?" "Terrified, but sure." She studied his face for a long moment, and Ethan made himself stand there without flinching, without retreating, letting her see every ounce of his fear and hope and desperate determination to be different than he'd been. Whatever she saw must have been enough, because she nodded once, decisive. "Then yes, I'll have you. I'll build this life with you, on one condition." "What's that?" "You have to keep choosing, deliberately, every day. Not just once when the fear gets overwhelming, but constantly. You have to choose connection over isolation, honesty over comfort, presence over protection." She moved closer. "Can you do that?" Ethan thought about the dead calf he'd sat with instead of walking away from. Thought about the 3 days in the storm when solitude had felt like dying. Thought about this woman who'd seen him at his most broken and called him toward something better. "I can try. I will try. Every damn day." Then that's enough. This time, when he kissed her, they were in full view of the schoolhouse, the street, the entire town. And Ethan didn't care. Didn't calculate the social implications or worry about propriety. Just kissed the woman he loved with complete honesty and zero apology. When they parted, Margaret was smiling, that rare, unguarded smile that made Ethan's chest tight. "Welcome home," she said, and for the first time in 15 years, Ethan believed it might be possible. The next month was chaos in the best possible way. Ethan hired 2 hands to manage the ranch's daily operations, made arrangements to board Ash in town, and slowly began the process of moving his life from isolation to community. It wasn't easy. He struggled with the constant presence of people, with the noise and complications of town life, with the vulnerability of having neighbors who notice things and ask questions. But Margaret was there, patient and relentless, refusing to let him retreat when things got difficult. She pushed him to accept dinner invitations, to participate in town meetings, to engage with the world he'd avoided for so long. And slowly, grudgingly, Ethan began to understand what he'd been missing. Community wasn't a threat. It was a resource. People weren't all waiting to hurt him. Some of them genuinely wanted to help. It was a revelation that felt both obvious and profound. In late February, Sam Hewitt approached Ethan with a proposal. The territorial government was organizing a major cattle drive to the railhead in Billings, combining stock from multiple ranches to maximize efficiency and security. The money was substantial, enough to secure Ethan's financial future for years. But the drive would take 6 weeks, maybe more, through difficult country and unpredictable weather. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Ethan had worked toward for years, the kind of thing that could transform a modest operation into something significant. It was also exactly the kind of thing that would require him to leave Margaret, to choose the ranch over their relationship, security over connection, practical necessity over personal commitment. Ethan stood in Sam's office looking at the contract and felt everything Margaret had taught him hanging in the balance. "I need to think about it," he said. Sam blinked. "Think about it? Ethan, this is a fortune. This is everything you've been working toward." "I know, but it's not a decision I can make alone anymore." He found Margaret grading papers at the boarding house that evening. She looked up when he entered, saw his expression, and set down her pen. "What happened?" Ethan told her about the cattle drive, the opportunity, the money, the timing. Margaret listened quietly, and when he finished, she asked the question he'd been dreading. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Practically, it makes sense. Financially, it's the smart choice, but it means leaving. For 6 weeks or more. Right when we're building something. Right when I'm learning how to be present instead of distant." Ethan sat down heavily. "I'm afraid that if I choose the ranch over you even once, it'll prove that I haven't really changed, that I'm still the same person who chooses safety over meaning." "Do you think that's true?" "I don't know. That's what scares me." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. When she spoke, her voice was careful, thoughtful. "I think you're confusing presence with proximity. They're not the same thing." "How do you mean?" "Being present doesn't mean physically being here every moment. It means engaging honestly with your life, your choices, your commitments, wherever you are. It means not hiding behind practical necessity when you're really running from fear." She looked at him directly. "So the question isn't whether you should go on the drive. The question is why you'd go. Are you going because it's genuinely important to your future? Or are you going because it gives you an excuse to retreat?" Ethan sat with that, turning it over in his mind. And slowly, with Margaret's patient gaze on him, he began to untangle his own motivations. The money was important. The ranch's future was important. But if he was honest, truly honest, part of him wanted to go because it was familiar. Because 6 weeks on a cattle drive was a known quantity, something he understood and could control. Because being alone with animals and weather and distance was easier than continuing to learn how to be vulnerable with another person. "I think," he said slowly, "that I want to go for the wrong reasons. Maybe, but maybe you also want to go for the right ones. How do I tell the difference?" Margaret reached across the table, took his hand. "You ask yourself, if you go, will you spend the entire time wishing you were here? Will you be present on the drive, or will you be mentally running away? And if you stay, will you resent me for it? Will you feel trapped by this relationship instead of choosing it freely?" Those were harder questions. Ethan closed his eyes, made himself sit with the discomfort of not having easy answers. "I think," he said finally, "that if I go, I'll miss you terribly. But I won't be running away. I'll be handling my responsibilities so that when I come back, we can build something stable together. Something that isn't dependent on me abandoning everything I've worked for. And if I stay, I'd wonder if I was choosing you out of fear of losing you, rather than choosing you because I genuinely want to build this life." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then go." "What?" Go on the drive, handle your business, secure your future. She squeezed his hand. But come back. And when you do, come back because you choose to, not because you're obligated to. Come back ready to build something real. Ethan stared at her, feeling something shift in his chest.
This story was
You
posted
sure?
on the channel west of
I'm sure
Betrayal.
that I don't want a
Please do not
relationship built
repost
on
it in
fear
any
of
form.
loss. I want a partnership built on deliberate choice. And that means trusting you to go do what you need to do, and trusting myself to still be here when you return. It was the most generous, terrifying gift anyone had ever given him. Complete trust. No manipulation, no demands, just honest acknowledgement that they both had lives and choices and futures that needed tending. I love you, Ethan said, simple and true. Margaret's breath caught. I love you too. Now go. Do what you need to do, and then come home. So Ethan went. He signed on for the cattle drive, spent a week preparing, said a careful goodbye to Margaret on the steps of the schoolhouse where they'd first begun to build something real. And then he rode north with 300 head of cattle, 12 other ranchers, and a purpose that felt different than anything he'd known before. Because this time, he wasn't running. He was choosing, deliberately, honestly. And for the first time in 15 years, Ethan Cole was learning what it meant to live. The drive started well enough. 300 head of prime cattle, 12 ranchers and their hands, clear weather and open country stretching north toward Billings. Ethan rode flank position, keeping the stragglers moving, his mind occupied with the familiar rhythm of work that had defined most of his adult life. But something was different this time. The solitude that had once felt like refuge now felt incomplete. At night, when the other men gathered around the fire to play cards and swap stories, Ethan found himself joining them instead of retreating to the edges of camp. Not because he'd suddenly become social, but because isolation no longer served the purpose it once had. He thought about Margaret constantly, wondered what she was teaching her students, whether the schoolhouse stove was keeping them warm enough, if she missed him the way he missed her. The longing was physical, an ache in his chest that didn't fade with distance. But it wasn't the desperate, fearful thing he'd expected. It was clean, honest. The natural consequence of loving someone and choosing to be temporarily apart. Sam Hewitt rode up alongside him on the fourth day, his horse matching Ash's steady pace. You're different, Sam observed without preamble. How so? Can't quite put my finger on it. Less closed off, maybe, like you're actually here instead of just going through the motions. Sam squinted at the horizon. That schoolteacher's doing, I suspect. Ethan didn't deny it. She has a way of making you see things clearly. That she does. Whole town's talking about you two, you know? Some folks think you're crazy for courting such a strong-minded woman. Others think she's crazy for choosing a hermit rancher. Sam grinned. Me? I think you're both braver than most people manage to be. Brave or stupid? Little bit of both, probably. Best things usually are. They rode in companionable silence for a while, and Ethan realized this was another thing that had changed. He could exist alongside another person without feeling threatened by their presence, could accept casual friendship without constantly calculating exit strategies. Margaret had taught him that, had shown him, through patience and relentless honesty, that walls didn't keep you safe, they just kept you alone. On the 8th day, they crossed into rougher territory where the land turned broken and unpredictable. The weather shifted too, clouds building on the western horizon with the bruised color that promised trouble. The trail boss, a grizzled man named Dutch Keller, who'd been running drives for 30 years, called a halt early to make camp in a protected canyon. Storm's coming, Dutch announced, his weathered face grim. Big one by the look of it. We'll hole up here, keep the cattle contained, ride it out. The storm hit 2 hours after sunset with a violence that made the February blizzard back at the ranch seem gentle. Wind howled through the canyon like something alive and furious, driving rain mixed with sleet that felt like gravel against exposed skin. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, and thunder rolled through the narrow space with enough force to spook the already nervous cattle. Ethan spent the night in the saddle, riding the perimeter with the other men, trying to keep 300 terrified animals from stampeding into the darkness. His clothes were soaked through within minutes, water running down his neck and back, his hands numb on the reins. Ash was exhausted but steady, responding to Ethan's commands even as the world turned chaotic around them. Around midnight, everything went to hell. A lightning strike hit a dead cottonwood 50 yards from the main herd. The tree exploded in a shower of sparks and burning wood, and the cattle broke. Just shattered into panicked motion, 300 animals suddenly running in every direction at once, their bellowing mixing with thunder and wind into a cacophony of pure terror. Ethan kicked Ash into motion, chasing after the cattle streaming toward the canyon's narrow mouth. If they got out into open country in this storm, scattered across miles of darkness and broken ground, they'd lose half the herd or more. Everything depended on containing them here, in this canyon, until the storm passed and reason returned. He saw Dutch ahead, trying to block the canyon mouth, his horse rearing and spinning as cattle surged around him. Sam was there too, and 2 other ranchers Ethan barely knew. They were forming a living wall, their horses pressed shoulder to shoulder, trying to turn the herd back on itself. Ethan joined them, adding Ash's bulk to the barrier. For a few desperate minutes it worked. The lead cattle turned, confused by the obstruction, milling in chaotic circles while the rest of the herd pressed forward from behind. Then someone screamed. Ethan turned his head, saw one of the younger hands, kid named Billy, maybe 19, trying to control a spooked horse near the canyon wall. The horse reared, Billy lost his balance, and suddenly he was falling, tumbling into the mass of churning cattle with nothing but his own body between him and thousands of pounds of panicked beef. Without thinking, Ethan wheeled Ash around and drove straight into the herd. It was insanity, suicide, the kind of reckless move that got cowboys killed on every drive. But Ethan's body was moving on pure instinct, his mind clear and focused in a way it had never been before. He found Billy in the chaos, the kid curled on the ground trying to protect his head while hooves crashed down around him. Ethan leaned low into saddle, grabbed Billy's jacket with one hand, and hauled him up with a strength born of desperation. The kid weighed next to nothing, all bones and fear, and Ethan dragged him across Ash's neck like a sack of grain, then kicked the horse toward the canyon wall where the press of bodies was thinner. They almost made it. Almost. Ethan felt the impact before he understood what had happened. Something massive slammed into Ash's hindquarters, probably a bull, panicked and blind, and the horse went down. Ethan kicked free of the stirrups, managed to push Billy toward the canyon wall, but his own momentum carried him the wrong direction. Into the herd. Into the darkness. Into the churning mass of terrified animals that couldn't see him and wouldn't care if they could. Pain exploded across his ribs, then his shoulder. Then something caught his leg and twisted, and Ethan heard himself scream over the thunder and the bellowing and the sound of his own bones breaking. He tried to stand, to fight his way clear, but his leg wouldn't hold him. Tried to crawl, but cattle were everywhere, their hooves striking ground and flesh with equal indifference. The world was spinning, tilting, fragmenting into discrete moments of agony separated by brief seconds of nothing. Then Dutch was there, his horse plowing through the herd like a battering ram. He grabbed Ethan's collar, started dragging him, and Ethan felt consciousness slipping away like water through his fingers. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the storm still raging overhead, lightning illuminating clouds that looked like mountains, like monuments, like the end of everything. He woke to fire. Not the herd, not the storm, something worse, something internal. His entire body felt like it was burning from the inside out, every nerve screaming, every breath a battle against some invisible weight crushing his chest. Ethan tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his ribs, his shoulder, his leg. He made a sound that might have been a curse or a whimper and forced his eyes open. Canvas overhead, a tent, daylight filtering through, weak and gray, the smell of wood smoke and something medicinal. Voices nearby, low and worried. Never seen infection set in that fast. Bullet's still in there. We can't get it deep enough. Maybe if we could get him to a doctor, but the nearest town's 3 days' ride. Bullet. The word penetrated the fog of pain and confusion. Ethan tried to process it, the storm, the stampede, the cattle, but no guns. Nobody had fired any guns. He's awake. Sam's face appeared above him, drawn and exhausted. Easy, Ethan. Don't try to move. You're pretty banged up. What? His voice came out like gravel, throat raw and painful. What happened? You got caught in the stampede, saved Billy's life, got yourself half killed in the process. That was 3 days ago. 3 days. Ethan tried to understand that. 3 days of nothing. 3 days lost to fever and pain. The bullet wasn't a stampede injury. That happened after. Sam's expression went dark. Rustlers
This story
hit
was
us the morning
posted
after
on the channel
storm,
west of
while we
Betrayal.
were still scattered
Please
and
do not
trying to
repost
regroup.
it in any
We
form.
fought them off, but you caught a round in the shoulder. Been unconscious and feverish ever since. Rustlers. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to push through the pain and confusion to understand the shape of what had happened. The stampede had been an accident, weather and fear, and bad luck. But the rustlers, that was deliberate, organized. The kind of thing that required planning and opportunity. The kind of thing Martin Gaines might arrange. How many did we lose? 70 head. Could have been worse. Dutch says you saved the bulk of the herd when you blocked that canyon mouth. Sam hesitated. Billy's alive too, by the way. Kid won't stop talking about how you rode into a stampede to save him. You're a damn hero, Ethan, even if you're too stubborn to admit it. Hero. The word tasted bitter. Heroes didn't end up shot and broken and burning with infection in a tent 3 days from civilization. I need to get back, Ethan managed. Need to. You're not going anywhere. You can barely breathe, your leg's broken, and that shoulder wound is infected worse than anything I've seen outside a war. Sam's voice was gentle but firm. Dutch rode ahead to Billings to fetch a doctor. Should be back tomorrow, maybe the day after. Until then, you stay put. Try not to die. Try not to die. Simple advice. Harder than it sounded. Over the next 2 days, Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind fragmenting under the assault of fever and pain. Sometimes he thought he was back at the ranch, checking cattle in the snow. Sometimes he was 17 again, watching his mother die while fever consumed her the same way it was consuming him now. And sometimes he was with Margaret, sitting on the bench outside Brennan's store, her hand warm in his, her voice steady as she told him that moments were all anyone ever had. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty tent, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to Margaret or to himself or to the life he might not get to live. "I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I thought I could—" Shh. A cool cloth touched his forehead, and for a moment Ethan thought maybe he'd died and this was whatever came after. But the voice that spoke was Dutch's, rough and practical. "Save your strength, Cole. Doctor'll be here soon. Margaret, we'll get word to her, soon as you're stable, but first you gotta stabilize." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to explain that Margaret needed to know now, needed to understand that he hadn't chosen to leave her, that the drive had turned dangerous and wrong and nothing like what he'd planned. But the words wouldn't come, and the fever was pulling him back down into darkness. In the depths of that darkness, Ethan confronted the truth he'd been avoiding since the day Margaret had challenged him outside the schoolhouse. He was terrified of dying. Not because of the physical end. He'd made peace with mortality years ago, watching his family succumb to disease. But because dying now would prove his deepest fear correct. That love destroyed. That caring made you vulnerable. That opening your heart meant giving the world a weapon to break you. If he died here, shot by rustlers while trying to build a future with Margaret, it would confirm everything he'd believed for 15 years. Would prove that isolation was safety, that distance was survival, that the only way to protect yourself was to never let anyone matter enough to hurt you. And Margaret would be left alone, having trusted him to come back, having believed he was brave enough to choose connection over fear. The thought was unbearable. Ethan fought the fever with everything he had, fought through pain that made him want to scream, through delirium that tried to convince him he was already dead, through moments of absolute despair when surrender seemed easier than survival. But he thought about Margaret's voice telling him that moments were everything, thought about her hands in his, steady and strong, thought about the life they could build if he was just stubborn enough to live. And slowly, agonizingly, the fever began to break. The doctor arrived on the 5th day, a severe woman named Dr. Catherine Winters, who took one look at Ethan's infected shoulder and started issuing orders like a field general. She cleaned the wound with something that felt like liquid fire, extracted the bullet with a blade that cut deeper than the original injury, and stitched him up with needle and thread while Ethan bit down on leather and tried not to pass out. "You're lucky," she said when it was done. "Another day and you'd have lost the arm, maybe more." "Don't feel lucky," Ethan managed. "Lucky and smart are different things. Smart would have been not getting shot in the first place." But her expression softened slightly. "That said, Sam tells me you saved a boy's life during the stampede. That took courage. Took stupidity. Same thing, most of the time." Dr. Winters began packing her instruments. "You'll heal. The leg will take 6 weeks, maybe more. The shoulder needs rest and clean bandages daily. And the ribs, well, those just hurt. Not much to be done except wait." "When can I travel?" "You shouldn't. Not for at least 2 weeks. Need to get back to Dry Creek. There's always someone." Dr. Winters cut him off. "But that someone would rather have you alive and late than dead and punctual. You'll heal here, then travel when you're strong enough. That's not a suggestion, Mr. Cole. That's medical necessity." Ethan wanted to argue. Wanted to insist he could ride now, injured or not, because every day he stayed here was another day Margaret didn't know what had happened. Another day she might think he'd chosen the drive over her. Another day his absence might confirm her worst fears about whether he was truly capable of choosing connection. But his body had other plans. Even sitting up made him dizzy, and the thought of climbing into a saddle was laughable. Dr. Winters was right. He wasn't going anywhere. "Can someone carry a message?" he asked Sam that evening. "To Margaret, let her know what happened." "Already done. Sent a rider 3 days ago with word that you were injured but alive. Should have reached Dry Creek by now." Sam settled onto a stool beside Ethan's cot. Figured she'd want to know sooner rather than later. Relief washed through Ethan, so intense it was almost painful. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. She might ride up here and kill you herself for getting shot." Despite everything, Ethan smiled. "She might at that." The smile faded as another thought occurred to him. "The rustlers. Did Dutch recognize any of them?" Sam's expression darkened. "2 of them. Small-time hired guns out of Helena. The kind of men who'll do anything for enough money." He paused. "Dutch thinks it was a planned hit. Someone knew about the drive, knew the route, knew we'd be vulnerable after the storm. Gaines. Can't prove it. But yeah, that's the thinking." Sam leaned forward. "Thing is, Ethan, this isn't over. Those men failed to take the herd, but they succeeded in slowing us down, costing us money, and nearly killing you in the process. Whoever hired them got part of what they wanted. Which is? Proof that caring about something makes you vulnerable. Proof that the moment you stop protecting yourself every second, someone will find a way to hurt you." The words hit harder than Sam probably intended, because that was exactly what Ethan's old self would have believed. Would have taken this injury, this betrayal, this violence, and used it as evidence that love was a liability. That opening himself to Margaret had made him a target. That isolation had been right all along. But lying in that tent, his body broken but his mind finally clear, Ethan understood something fundamental. The rustlers hadn't attacked because he loved Margaret. They'd attacked because someone like Gaines, someone who believed power came from control and fear, saw Ethan's transformation as a threat. Saw a man choosing connection over isolation and recognized it as dangerous to the entire structure of how frontier society operated. Because if one man could change, could choose vulnerability over strength, presence over protection, then maybe others could too. And that would undermine everything people like Gaines had built their lives around. "Sam," Ethan said quietly, "when I can travel, I need you to do something for me. Name it. Help me get back to Dry Creek, to Margaret, whatever it takes, however long it takes. Because I need her to see that I'm choosing to come back. Not because I have to, not because I'm obligated, but because she taught me that fear isn't what kills you, hiding from fear is." Sam studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we'll get you home. But Ethan, when we do, you're going to have to face Gaines. A man like that doesn't stop just because you survived. He'll keep coming until someone stops him." "I know. You ready for that?" Ethan thought about the 15 years he'd spent hiding, the months he'd spent learning to be present, the woman who'd refused to let him retreat into comfortable lies. "I'm ready to try." Recovery was brutally slow. The leg was worst, a clean break below the knee that Dr. Winters had set and splinted, but which required complete immobility to heal properly. Ethan spent 2 weeks in that tent, going slowly mad with inactivity, while the rest of the drive completed its journey to Billings without him. Dutch stayed behind with 2 other men to watch over the injured, and they became Ethan's
This
unexpected
story was posted
companions
on the
in
channel
long
west
hours
of
healing.
Betrayal.
They played
Please
cards,
do not
told
repost it
stories,
in any form.
argued about cattle and weather and territorial politics. And slowly, Ethan began to understand another thing Margaret had been trying to teach him. Community didn't mean weakness. It meant having people who stayed when things got difficult, who sat with you through pain and boredom and uncertainty without expecting anything in return except that you do the same for them. It was Dutch who finally asked the question Ethan had been avoiding. "What are you scared of, Cole?" They were sitting outside the tent on a rare warm afternoon, watching clouds build over the mountains. Ethan's leg was propped on a crate, his shoulder still aching but healing clean. Lots of things. Specifically, right now, what's got you looking like a man heading for his own execution? Ethan was quiet for a moment, trying to articulate something he barely understood himself. "I'm scared that Margaret will realize I'm not worth the risk. That all this," he gestured at his injuries, "proves that loving me means accepting danger and complications she never asked for." Dutch snorted. "That's the dumbest thing I've heard all month, and I just spent 6 weeks with cowboys." "How so?" "You think she doesn't know that life is dangerous? That loving someone means accepting risk?" Dutch shook his head. "Cole, that woman rode into frontier territory alone to teach children nobody else would bother with. She stood up to Gaines in front of the whole town. She let you go on this drive knowing damn well something might go wrong. She's not naive about danger. She's just brave enough to live anyway. Then why am I so terrified? Because you're confusing her strength with your weakness. You're thinking that if you're not perfect, not invulnerable, not completely in control, then you're not worthy of her love." Dutch leaned back, squinting at the sky. "But that's not how love works. Love isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest, about showing up broken and scared and letting someone see you anyway." Ethan absorbed that, turning it over in his mind. All his life, he'd believed survival meant self-sufficiency, that needing anyone was weakness, that showing vulnerability was inviting destruction. But Margaret had never asked him to be perfect, had never demanded invulnerability. She'd just asked him to be present, to be honest, to choose deliberately instead of hiding behind fear. And right now, broken and healing in a tent 300 miles from home, Ethan was choosing to go back, choosing to let Margaret see him injured and vulnerable, choosing to trust that love could survive imperfection. "You're right," Ethan said finally. "I am confused, but I'm trying to learn." "That's all anyone can do." Dutch stood, stretched. "Now come on. Doctor says you can try putting weight on that leg today. Time to see if you remember how to walk." Learning to walk again was its own special humiliation. Ethan had always taken physical capability for granted, had built his identity around being competent and self-sufficient. Now he had to relearn basic movements, had to accept help from others, had to acknowledge his own limitations. It was infuriating, humbling, and strangely liberating. Because accepting help didn't destroy him. Admitting weakness didn't make him vulnerable to attack. Being imperfect didn't mean being worthless. Margaret had been trying to teach him this for months. It had just taken getting shot and trampled to finally understand it. 3 weeks after the ambush, Dr. Winters declared Ethan fit enough to travel. Not healthy,
This
not by a
story
long
was
shot,
posted on the
but
channel
stable enough
west
to
of
survive a
Betrayal.
careful journey
Please
back
do
to
not
Dry Creek.
repost it in any
Sam
form.
had stayed behind to escort him, claiming business in town that needed handling anyway. But Ethan knew the truth. Sam was making sure he got home, making sure Margaret didn't spend one more day wondering if the man she loved was coming back. They rode slowly, covering maybe 20 miles a day instead of the 40 a healthy man could manage. Ethan's leg throbbed constantly, his shoulder ached, and his ribs protested every movement, but he was going home. That made every bit of pain worthwhile. They were 2 days out from Dry Creek when Sam asked the question, "What are you going to do about Gaines?" Ethan had been thinking about that for 3 weeks, thinking about power and control, about men who used fear as currency, about the difference between strength and cruelty. I'm going to tell the truth, he said, about the rustlers, about who likely hired them, about what happened on the drive. He shifted in the saddle, trying to ease the pressure on his leg. And then I'm going to let the community decide. Because Margaret taught me that you don't fight control with more control. You fight it with transparency and trust. That's a gamble. Everything's a gamble. But I'd rather gamble on people's decency than guarantee my safety through isolation. Sam smiled. She really did change you, didn't she? She showed me I could change myself. There's a difference. They rode in silence for a while, the mountains growing larger on the horizon, home getting closer with each step. One more thing, Sam said eventually. When you see Margaret and she sees you looking like you lost a fight with a threshing machine, don't apologize. Why not? Because apologizing suggests you did something wrong. You didn't. You made a choice. Things went bad, but you survived and you're coming back. That's not something to apologize for. That's something to celebrate. Ethan thought about that, about the difference between guilt and responsibility, about how his old self would have apologized endlessly, would have used contrition as armor against vulnerability. But Margaret didn't want armor. She wanted honesty. All right, Ethan agreed. No apologies, just truth. Now you're learning. They reached Dry Creek just after noon on a Thursday, the same day of the week Ethan had always visited during those careful months of courtship. The town looked unchanged, same buildings, same streets, same rhythm of frontier life continuing regardless of individual drama. But Ethan had changed, and as they rode down Main Street toward the schoolhouse, he felt the weight of that change settling around him like a new skin. People stared, whispered. Some called out greetings mixed with concern. News of the ambush had clearly preceded him, probably carried by the rider Sam had sent weeks ago. Everyone knew Ethan Cole had been injured. Everyone was curious about how bad it was, whether he could still work, whether he'd retreat back to his ranch in isolation. Ethan ignored them all. His focus was singular, absolute. The schoolhouse door was closed, class in session. Ethan dismounted carefully, his leg protesting the movement, and limped toward the building with Sam trailing behind. He knocked once, waited. Heard Margaret's voice call out. "Come in." Ethan opened the door. 20 children's faces turned toward him, curious and startled. And there, at the front of the room by the blackboard, was Margaret. She looked exactly the same. Dark hair pinned back, practical dress, sharp eyes that missed nothing. But when those eyes landed on Ethan, taking in his limp, his splinted leg, his arms still held carefully against his chest, the weight he'd lost, the pallor that hadn't quite faded, something cracked in her expression. "Children," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "Please take out your readers and begin chapter 7, quietly. I'll be just outside." She crossed the room in measured steps, her control absolute, and gestured for Ethan to follow her out onto the schoolhouse steps. The door closed behind them. Margaret turned to face him, and then, without warning, she broke. Not crying, not collapsing, just a sharp, shaking breath, and a hand pressed hard against her mouth, as if holding back words that might shatter both of them. "I'm here," Ethan said quietly. "I came back." "I can see that." Her voice wavered, steadied. "You look terrible." "Feel worse." "Good. You should." But she was moving toward him, her hands reaching out to touch his face, his shoulder, his chest, checking for reality, for solidity, for proof that he was actually alive and standing before her. "I thought—" She stopped, started again. "When the rider came, when he said you'd been shot and trampled, and they didn't know if you'd survive, I thought I'd lost you. Thought I'd let you go and you'd never come back. I promised I would. People break promises when they're dying, Ethan." "I wasn't going to die." He said it with absolute certainty, even though for days it had been a very real possibility, because I had too much to come back to. Margaret's hand stilled on his chest. "What happened out there?" The writer said rustlers, said an ambush, but I'll tell you everything. But first, I need you to know something. Ethan took her hands, held them carefully. "What happened wasn't your fault. Not because you let me go, Not because I chose the drive, not because we're building a life together. It happened because someone who believes power comes from fear tried to destroy what we're building, and he failed. He nearly
This
killed
story
you.
was posted on the channel
Nearly
West
isn't the
of
same as
Betrayal.
did.
Please do
Ethan
not
squeezed her
repost
hands
it in any
gently.
form.
I'm here, Margaret. Broken and healing and probably going to be useless for weeks. But I'm here. And I'm choosing to be here. Deliberately. The same way I chose to leave. The same way I'll keep choosing every day we have together. Margaret searched his face, and Ethan let her see everything. The fear, the pain, the absolute determination that had brought him back across 300 miles of territory when his body had screamed at him to give up. You really mean that, she said softly. Every word. She pulled him close then, carefully mindful of his injuries, and Ethan wrapped his arms around her and held on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. Which, in a way, she was. They stood together on the schoolhouse steps while the afternoon sun warmed the March air and life continued around them. And for the first time since the stampede, since the ambush, since the long weeks of fever and recovery, Ethan Cole felt complete. Not healed, not undamaged, but whole in the way that mattered most. He'd been broken by fear and made new by love, and he was finally beginning to understand that one was worth surviving the other. They stayed like that until the sound of restless children through the schoolhouse door reminded Margaret she had responsibilities beyond the man in her arms. She pulled back reluctantly, her hands lingering on his face. You need rest, real rest, not whatever you've been doing for 3 weeks on the trail. I need to talk to you, properly, about everything that happened. Tonight then, Mrs. Chen's boarding house, after supper. I'll make sure we have privacy. Margaret's expression shifted, becoming sharper, more focused. And Ethan, bring Sam if he's still in town. We need to discuss Gaines and what comes next. You think he'll try again? I think men like Martin Gaines don't stop until someone forces them to. And I think we need a plan that doesn't involve you getting shot a second time. Despite everything, Ethan smiled. Yes, ma'am. She kissed him then, quick and fierce, before stepping back into her teacher role as completely as if she'd donned a uniform. Go, find somewhere to rest that leg. And Ethan, I'm glad you're alive. Me too. Sam had secured them rooms at the boarding house, and Ethan spent the afternoon lying on an actual mattress for the first time in weeks, his body slowly remembering what it felt like to be horizontal without canvas overhead. Sleep came in waves, interrupted by pain and restless dreams, but underneath it all was a profound sense of relief. He was home. Whatever came next, he'd face it here, with Margaret, instead of alone in the mountains, convinced isolation was safety. That evening, Ethan limped down to the boarding house's small dining room where Mrs. Chen had set aside a corner table for privacy. Margaret was already there, changed into a simple blue dress, her hair still pinned but with those familiar loose strands escaping around her face. Sam arrived moments later, looking tired but alert. So, Margaret said once they were all seated, tell me everything. Ethan did. He spoke about the drive, the storm, the stampede that should have been tragedy, but had instead revealed something about who he was capable of being. He described the ambush, the hired guns Dutch had recognized, the bullet and the fever, and the long weeks of recovery when death had seemed easier than survival. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face growing harder with each detail. When Ethan finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Gaines orchestrated this. You're certain? Can't
This
prove it
story
in
was
any way that
posted
would
on the
hold up
channel
legally,
West
Sam
of
said.
Betrayal.
But the men
Please do not
involved were known to
repost
take
it
his
in
money
any
in the
form.
past. The timing was too convenient, and Gaines has been spreading rumors since Ethan left town, saying the ranch would fail, that Ethan was in over his head, that this whole cattle drive was a desperate gamble by a man who'd let sentiment make him weak. He's creating a narrative, Margaret said thoughtfully, one where Ethan's relationship with me is the cause of his downfall, where choosing connection over isolation equals failure. Exactly. And if Ethan had died out there, that narrative would have been complete, would have served as a warning to anyone else thinking about changing their ways. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. This isn't just about me and you, is it? It's bigger than that. Much bigger, Margaret agreed. Gaines represents a particular kind of frontier masculinity, One that says strength comes from domination, control, and emotional isolation. You represent something different, something that threatens the entire structure of power he's built his life around. What do we do about it? We tell the truth, publicly, completely. We expose what happened on that drive, who was likely responsible, and why it matters. Margaret leaned forward, her voice intense. But more importantly, we show that you survived, that choosing vulnerability didn't destroy you, that love and connection can coexist with strength and capability. Sam nodded slowly. There's a town meeting next week. We could bring it up then, force Gaines to respond in front of the whole community. He'll deny everything, Ethan said. Of course he will. But denial isn't the same as disproving. If we present the facts clearly, the timeline, the hired guns Dutch recognized, the pattern of harassment toward Margaret, people will draw their own conclusions. It was a risk, a significant one. Confronting Gaines publicly could backfire spectacularly, could turn the town against them, could result in violence that would make the ambush look gentle. But the alternative was letting fear dictate their choices, was allowing Gaines to control the narrative through intimidation and lies, was proving that his way, isolation, dominance, emotional emptiness, was the only viable path to survival. All right, Ethan said, we do it. But Margaret, this could get ugly. If Gaines feels cornered, then he'll lash out. Yes, I'm aware. Her eyes were hard, determined. But I didn't come to this territory to hide from difficult men. I came to build something better, and that means standing up when standing up is dangerous. She was magnificent, Ethan thought, absolutely terrifying and completely magnificent. There's something else, Sam said carefully. The drive money. We lost 70 head, which means the profit is significantly reduced. Not enough to ruin you, Ethan, but enough that you'll need to make some hard choices about the ranch's future. Ethan had been avoiding thinking about this, had pushed it aside while dealing with more immediate concerns like staying alive. But Sam was right. The financial reality was unavoidable. How bad? Bad enough that keeping 2 full-time hands year-round isn't sustainable. You'll need to scale back, at least temporarily, maybe permanently, depending on how next year goes. Which meant the plan he'd made before leaving, the plan to hire help so he could spend more time in town with Margaret, was no longer viable. At least not in the way he'd imagined. Margaret was watching him carefully. What are you thinking? That I might have to choose after all, between the ranch and being here. The words tasted bitter. Not because I want to, but because I can't afford not to. Or, Margaret said slowly, we find a different way. What do you mean? She glanced at Sam, who nodded as if they'd already discussed this. What if you didn't try to maintain the ranch exactly as it is? What if you adapted it, made it smaller, more manageable, something one person could handle most of the year with help only during critical seasons? That would mean selling off a significant portion of the herd, maybe some of the land. Yes. It would also mean accepting that you can't control everything, can't maintain perfect independence, can't keep pretending you're the same man who bought that land 15 years ago. Ethan felt something shifting inside him. The ranch had been his identity for so long, the physical manifestation of his belief that isolation equaled survival. Letting go of part of it felt like admitting defeat, but maybe it wasn't defeat. Maybe it was evolution. I built that place to be self-sufficient, he said quietly, to prove I didn't need anyone or anything, to create a fortress where loss couldn't touch me. I know, Margaret said gently, but you're not that person anymore, and the ranch doesn't have to be a fortress. It can be something else, a home, a livelihood, a resource, but not a prison. The truth of it was undeniable. Ethan had changed. The man who'd saved Billy during the stampede, who'd fought through fever because he had someone to return to, who was sitting here now planning to confront Gaines publicly, that man didn't need a fortress. It would be a significant change, Sam said, but Ethan, you'd still own land, still have cattle, still have your independence, just not at the cost of everything else. Would it be enough? Financially? To support yourself? Yes. To support a family? Sam paused meaningfully. Eventually, Yes, with careful management and Margaret's teaching salary. A family. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ethan looked at Margaret, saw something vulnerable in her expression despite her usual composure. "We haven't talked about that," she said. "About marriage, about children, about what we're actually building here." "No, we haven't." Ethan reached across the table, took her hand. "But I think it's time we did." Sam stood, suddenly very interested in something across the room. "I'll just go check on something. Elsewhere. You two talk." He disappeared quickly, leaving Ethan and Margaret alone in the corner of the dining room with the weight of the future pressing down on them. "I want to marry you," Ethan said. Simple. Direct. True. "I wanted to ask properly, romantically, when I got back from the drive. Had a whole plan involving the creek and the cottonwoods and probably making a fool of myself." Margaret's lips twitched. "And now? Now I'm sitting here broken and uncertain about the future, and I still want to marry you. Which seems more honest, actually." "It does." She studied their joined hands. "But Ethan, I need you to understand what you'd be agreeing to. I'm not going to stop teaching. I'm not going to become some quiet rancher's wife who stays home and keeps house and asks no questions. I'm going to keep pushing you, keep challenging the town, keep demanding that people live up to their potential instead of their fears. I know. I'm going to want children, at least one, maybe more, and I'm going to raise them to think critically, to question authority, to believe that strength and vulnerability can coexist. Good. I'm going to disagree with you, frequently, sometimes loudly. I'm not easy, Ethan. I never have been." "Margaret," he squeezed her hand, waiting until she looked up at him. "I don't want easy. I want you. Exactly as you are. Sharp and stubborn and completely unwilling to accept comfortable lies. Even when it's inconvenient? Especially then." She was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "Ask me properly then. Right now, in this boarding house, with you looking half dead and me looking exhausted. Ask me honestly." Ethan took a breath, let it out, made himself be completely present in this moment, not planning ahead, not calculating outcomes, not protecting himself against potential loss. "Margaret Hale, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me that's honest and difficult and probably chaotic? Will you help me learn how to be present instead of protected, how to choose deliberately instead of hiding behind fear? Will you trust me enough to let me fail sometimes, as long as I keep trying?" Margaret's eyes were bright. "Yes, to all of it, as long as you promise to do the same for me." "I promise." "Then yes, Ethan Cole, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, right there in Mrs. Chen's boarding house, with probably half the town able to see through the windows. Kissed her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world, because in many ways, she was. When they finally parted, Margaret was smiling, that rare, unguarded smile that Ethan had learned to treasure. "We should probably tell people," she said, eventually. "First, we need to deal with Gaines, get through the town meeting, make sure we're still alive and employed afterward." "Always so romantic." "I'm practical now. You taught me that." "I taught you to be honest. There's a difference." They stayed in the boarding house for another hour, talking through plans and possibilities. The wedding would be simple, practical. No elaborate ceremony, just vows exchanged in front of people they trusted. They'd live in town initially in whatever
This story
space
was
they could
posted
afford,
on the channel
and
west
Ethan
of
would ride
Betrayal.
out to the ranch as
Please
needed.
do not repost
Eventually,
it in any
maybe
form.
they'd build a house that was closer to town, that could accommodate children and the life they were creating. It wasn't the future Ethan had imagined 15 years ago when he'd bought land and convinced himself isolation was strength. But it was real, honest, built on choice rather than fear, and that made it infinitely more valuable. The week leading up to the town meeting was strange. Word of Ethan's return and the engagement spread quickly, as news always did in small towns. Reactions were mixed. Some people offered congratulations and genuine happiness. Others were skeptical, worried, convinced this was a recipe for disaster. Martin Gaines said nothing publicly, which was more concerning than if he'd made threats. Silence from a man like that usually meant he was planning something. Ethan spent the time recovering, his legs slowly strengthening, his shoulder healing clean under Dr. Winter's instructions. Margaret brought him books from the schoolhouse, and they spent evenings reading together in the boarding house parlor, existing in companionable silence that felt more intimate than conversation. But underneath the peaceful routine was tension. Both of them knew the confrontation was coming, knew that Gaines wouldn't simply accept public accusation without retaliation. "Whatever happens at that meeting," Margaret said the night before, "we stay together. Physically, I mean. Don't let him separate us. Don't let him isolate either of us." "You think he'll try something during the meeting?" "I think desperate men do desperate things, and we're about to make him very desperate." The meeting was held on a Saturday evening in the largest building in town, the church that doubled as a community hall. By the time Ethan and Margaret arrived, walking in together with Sam flanking them protectively, the room was already packed. Every rancher, shopkeeper, and concerned citizen in the territory seemed to be present. Gaines was there too, sitting in the front row with his supporters clustered around him like a private army. When he saw Ethan, his expression flickered. Surprise, quickly masked, followed by something harder. Calculation. Sam had arranged for Dutch Keller to attend, and the grizzled trail boss stood near the back wall, his presence a silent testament to everything that had happened on the drive. A few other men from the cattle drive had come too, men who'd seen the ambush, who'd helped Ethan survive. The meeting started with routine business: water rights, road maintenance, territorial taxes. Ethan sat with Margaret's hand in his, feeling his heart rate climbing as they approached the moment when Sam would bring up what really mattered. Finally, Sam stood. "Before we conclude, there's something the community needs to hear about the cattle drive, about what really happened out there." The room went silent. Sam spoke clearly, methodically, laying out the facts. The storm, the stampede, Ethan's injury saving Billy, and then the ambush, the hired guns, the timing, the clear evidence of planning and coordination. "Dutch Keller recognized two of the men involved," Sam said. "Known criminals who've worked for certain parties in this territory before. This wasn't random violence. It was organized, deliberate, an attempt to destroy a man's livelihood and possibly his life." Gaines stood. "That's a serious accusation, Hewitt. I hope you have proof." "I have witness testimony. I have the physical evidence of Ethan's injuries. I have the fact that those hired guns disappeared immediately after the attack, which suggests they had somewhere safe to run to. None of that proves anything about who hired them." "No," Sam agreed. "But it does establish a pattern. Ethan starts courting Margaret. Gaines expresses interest in Margaret. Margaret rejects Gaines. Suddenly, Margaret's brake line is cut. Then Ethan announces he's restructuring his life to be present in town. Suddenly, he's ambushed during a critical cattle drive. Either that's remarkable coincidence or it's calculated intimidation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were making connections, reassessing old assumptions. Gaines's face had gone red. "You're accusing me of attempted murder based on coincidence and speculation. I'm asking the community to notice patterns and draw their own conclusions." "This is absurd. I'm a respected member of this town. I've contributed more to its development than some hermit rancher and an Eastern school teacher who doesn't understand frontier life." "That Eastern school teacher," Margaret said, standing up, her voice cutting through the growing noise, "understands that civilization isn't built on intimidation and violence. It's built on trust and accountability. And right now, Mr. Gaines, I'm asking you to be accountable." "For what? For wanting to protect this town from people who destroy it with soft thinking? For trying to murder a man because he dared to change, because he chose connection over isolation, because he represented a future you're terrified of, one where strength doesn't require cruelty, where men can be vulnerable without being weak, where power comes from community rather than control." The room was riveted now, everyone watching this confrontation play out. Gaines stepped toward Margaret, his body language aggressive. "You don't know what you're talking about. This territory requires hard men making hard choices, not school teachers playing at social reform." Ethan stood, moving to stand beside Margaret despite his legs' protest. "She knows exactly what she's talking about, and so do I, because I used to think the same way you do. Used to believe isolation was survival, that caring made you vulnerable, that the only way to protect yourself was to never let anyone matter." And look where that thinking got you. Shot, nearly killed, barely able to walk. Alive, Ethan said quietly. It got me alive. Because when I was dying from fever in that tent, I had a reason to fight. Had someone who mattered enough that surrender wasn't an option. You call that weakness. I call it the only thing that saved me. Dutch spoke up from the back. Cole's right. I've been running drives for 30 years, seen dozens of men face death on the trail. The ones who survive aren't the ones who are strongest or meanest. They're the ones who've got something worth surviving for. Other voices joined in. People who'd watched Ethan change over the past months. People who'd seen him choose vulnerability despite every instinct screaming at him to retreat. People who were tired of Gaines' bullying and ready for a different kind of leadership. The tide was turning. Ethan could feel it, could see it in the way people were sitting forward in their seats, in the way Gaines' supporters were looking uncertain. But Gaines wasn't finished. His hand dropped to his belt, where Ethan suddenly noticed a pistol he hadn't been wearing when the meeting started. You want accountability? Gaines' voice was low, dangerous. Fine. Let's settle this the frontier way. Cole, you've been accusing me of trying to kill you. So let's find out if you've got the spine to face me directly. The room erupted, people shouting, some urging calm, others egging on the confrontation. Sam moved forward, trying to get between them, but Gaines shoved him back. Just you and me, Cole. Right now, outside. We end this. Ethan felt Margaret's hand tighten on his arm, felt his own fear rising, not of death, but of proving Gaines right, of letting violence be the final arbiter, of falling back into the old pattern where strength meant domination and survival meant eliminating threats. No, he said clearly. The room went silent. What? Gaines looked genuinely confused. I said no, I'm not going to fight you. Not going to let you turn this into some demonstration of frontier masculinity where whoever's faster with a gun wins the argument. You're a coward. Maybe. Or maybe I just understand that real strength isn't about who can hurt who worse. It's about building something that lasts, something that doesn't require violence to maintain. You're weak. You've let this woman make you weak. She's made me honest. There's a difference. Ethan took a breath, made himself speak the truth he'd been learning for months. I spent 15 years hiding on a ranch, convincing myself I was strong because I needed nobody. But I was just scared. Terrified of being hurt again, of losing what I cared about. Margaret didn't make me weak. She made me brave enough to admit I was already broken, and brave enough to try healing. Gaines stared at him, comprehension finally dawning. You really believe that? You actually think refusing to defend yourself is courage? I think defending myself doesn't require killing you. I think I can stand here, injured and imperfect and completely vulnerable, and that doesn't mean I've lost. It means I've chosen a different battlefield. For a long moment, nobody moved. The entire room was frozen, watching this confrontation that had started as violence and transformed into something else entirely. Then Dutch spoke again. He's right, Gaines. You can shoot him if you want. Prove you're faster, prove you're willing to kill, but it won't change what everyone here just witnessed. Won't erase the fact that Cole stood here and chose honesty over violence, and won't stop the rest of us from holding you accountable for what you've done. Other voices joined in. Agreement. Support. A collective decision that violence wasn't acceptable, that Gaines' way wasn't the only way, that maybe this territory could build something better than fear and domination. Gaines looked around at the room, saw his power evaporating, and something crumbled in his expression. He wasn't going to shoot. Not here.
This story
not
was
now,
posted
not
on
with
the channel
dozens of
west
witnesses
of Betrayal.
and a community
Please
that
do
had
not
suddenly
repost
decided
it
they were
in any
tired of
form.
being controlled. You're all fools, he said finally. This town will collapse without strong leadership, without men willing to do what's necessary. Then maybe we don't need strong leadership, Margaret said. Maybe we need honest leadership. Maybe we need people who are willing to be vulnerable enough to admit when they're wrong, brave enough to change, and committed enough to build something based on trust rather than fear. Gaines holstered his pistol, his movements stiff with fury. He walked toward the door, his remaining supporters trailing behind him. At the threshold, he turned back. This isn't over. Yes, Ethan said quietly. It is. You just don't know it yet. Gaines left. The door slammed behind him, and the room erupted into conversation, excited, relieved, overwhelmed. Sam moved to Ethan's side. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Probably both, Ethan admitted. His leg was shaking from standing so long, his shoulder aching, his entire body exhausted from the confrontation. But it's done. We told the truth. The community heard us. And Gaines knows he's lost. He might retaliate. Men like that don't just accept defeat. Maybe. But if he does, he'll do it knowing the entire town is watching, knowing he's already been exposed. Ethan looked at Margaret, and knowing that fear doesn't control us anymore. The meeting concluded shortly after. People approached them, some to offer congratulations, others to express support, a few to voice continued skepticism. But the overall sense was one of shift, of change, of a community deciding collectively that they wanted to be something different than what they'd been. Walking back to the boarding house that night, with Margaret's arm through his and Sam walking protective guard, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Peace. Real peace. Not the forced calm of isolation, but the genuine tranquility of having faced fear honestly and survived. You know, Margaret said softly, when I first met you, I thought you were impossible. Too closed off, too damaged, too committed to your walls. What changed your mind? You did. Slowly, painfully, but completely. She squeezed his arm. You're not the man who saved me from that wagon. You're someone different, someone better. I'm the man you helped me become. No, you're the man you chose to become. I just refuse to let you settle for less. They reached the boarding house and paused on the steps. Above them, stars were emerging in the darkening sky, brilliant and indifferent and beautiful. What happens now? Ethan asked. Now we get married, build a home, start a life, face whatever comes next together. Margaret looked up at him. No guarantees, no certainty, no protection against loss, just honesty and presence and the willingness to keep choosing each other. Sounds terrifying. It is. Sounds perfect. It will be. Not perfectly perfect, but perfectly ours. Ethan kissed her there on the boarding house steps, with the whole town potentially watching and not caring in the slightest. Kissed her like she was his salvation and his challenge and his future all rolled into one fierce, brilliant, impossibly stubborn woman. When they parted, Margaret was smiling. Welcome home, Ethan Cole. And this time, finally, Ethan believed it completely. They married 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in April when the cottonwoods along the creek were just beginning to leaf out, and the air smelled of thawed earth and new grass. It wasn't the elaborate affair some townspeople had expected. No white dress imported from back east, no elaborate ceremony, no reception that went on for hours. Just Margaret in a simple gray dress she'd sewn herself, Ethan in his cleanest shirt and vest, and 20 people gathered in the schoolhouse where they'd first begun learning how to be honest with each other. Sam officiated, reading from a passage Margaret had chosen about partnership and choosing deliberately. Dutch stood as witness, along with Mrs. Chen and half a dozen students who'd begged to attend. Billy was there too, the young man Ethan had saved during the stampede, his presence a quiet reminder of what courage actually looked like. Martin Gaines was not invited. He'd left town 2 days after the confrontation at the meeting, selling his land to a consortium of smaller ranchers and disappearing toward Helena with bitter promises that the territory would regret its softness. Some of his supporters had gone with him. Others had stayed, quietly reassessing their positions now that the man who'd defined frontier masculinity for them had proven less invincible than they'd believed. When it came time for vows, Ethan took Margaret's hands and spoke the words they'd written together the night before. I promise to be present, to choose you deliberately every day, even when it's difficult, to be honest about my fears instead of hiding behind them, to build a life with you that's based on trust rather than control, on vulnerability rather than strength, on partnership rather than dominance. Margaret's eyes were bright as she responded, I promise to challenge you, to never let you retreat into comfortable silence, to demand that you live fully instead of merely surviving, to be your partner in building something real, messy and complicated and absolutely worth every risk. They exchanged simple gold bands that Ethan had commissioned from the town's metalsmith, engraved on the inside with a single word, choose. A reminder that love wasn't something that happened to you, but something you decided on repeatedly, deliberately, in the face of fear and uncertainty and all the ways the world tried to convince you isolation was safer. When Sam pronounced them married, Ethan kissed his wife with a sense of rightness that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The gathered witnesses cheered, the students giggled, and somewhere in the back Mrs. Chen was definitely crying despite her insistence that she never got emotional at weddings. The reception was held in the boarding house dining room, where Mrs. Chen had prepared an elaborate meal that probably violated several contracts about appropriate use of communal space. But nobody complained. The town had watched Ethan and Margaret's relationship develop with varying degrees of skepticism and support, and now that they'd actually married, there was a collective sense that maybe different wasn't dangerous. Maybe change was possible. Maybe the frontier could be more than just survival. Dutch raised a glass during the informal toasts. Known a lot of cowboys in my time, most of them tough as leather and about as flexible. But Cole here, he gestured toward Ethan with his whiskey. He figured out what most men never learn, that real strength isn't about never bending. It's about bending without breaking, about being honest enough to admit you need help, brave enough to accept it, and stubborn enough to keep trying even when it's hard. "Hear, hear," Sam called out, and others joined in. Ethan stood, his legs still healing but stronger now, and looked around at the faces of people who'd become something more than neighbors, something closer to community. "I don't have a fancy speech," he said. "Never been good with words the way Margaret is. But I want to thank everyone here for not giving up on me when I'd given up on myself, for showing me that isolation isn't the same as safety, for teaching me," he glanced at Margaret, "for forcing me to learn that living means risking loss. And that's not weakness. That's courage." Margaret stood beside him, her hand finding his. "And I want to thank this town for taking a chance on an opinionated schoolteacher who didn't fit the mold. For letting me teach your children that thinking critically isn't disrespectful. For showing me that the frontier isn't just a place of violence and hardship. It's a place where people can choose to build something better." They sat down to applause, and the celebration continued into the afternoon. Children ran between tables. Adults argued good-naturedly about politics and weather. And somewhere in the comfortable chaos, Ethan felt the last piece of his old self finally let go. He wasn't the man who'd bought land 15 years ago, convinced solitude was survival. He wasn't even the man who'd stopped a runaway wagon last October out of reflex rather than deliberate choice. He was someone new, forged through pain and love, and the relentless honesty of a woman who'd refused to let him hide. That night, in the small room they'd rented on the second floor of the boarding house, Margaret unpinned her hair and turned to face him. "Are you scared?" "Terrified," Ethan admitted. "But not of you, of failing you, of not being the partner you deserve." "Good. Because I'm scared too. Scared I'll push too hard, demand too much, forget that you're still learning how to be present." She moved closer. "But Ethan, we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be honest. I can do honest. I know. That's why I married you." They made love slowly, carefully, mindful of Ethan's still healing injuries and the newness of this intimacy. It wasn't the passionate collision Margaret had read about in novels or the expert performance Ethan had worried he couldn't provide. It was awkward and tender and completely real. Two people learning each other's bodies and boundaries, making mistakes and adjusting, laughing at their own nervousness. Afterward, lying in the dark with Margaret's head on his shoulder, Ethan felt more vulnerable than he'd ever been in his life. And for once, vulnerability didn't feel like weakness. It felt like
This story
trust.
was posted on the
"I
channel
love you,"
west of
he said
Betrayal.
quietly.
Please do not
"I don't say it
repost
enough,
it
but
in
I
any
do."
form.
"I know, you show it in other ways, but I like hearing it too. I'll try to say it more." "Good. Because I love you too. Even when you're stubborn and closed off and convinced you need to protect me from things I can handle myself." Ethan smiled in the darkness. "Especially then?" "Especially then." They fell asleep tangled together, and for the first time in 15 years, Ethan slept without nightmares. The months that followed were not easy. Marriage, as it turned out, required constant negotiation and adjustment. They argued about everything: where to live, how to split responsibilities, whether Ethan needed to check on the ranch as often as he thought he did. Margaret pushed him to be more present, to stop treating every trip to the ranch like an escape route. Ethan pushed back, trying to explain that some things required his personal attention, that delegating everything felt like abandoning responsibility. "You're doing it again," Margaret said one evening in June. They were in their small rented room, and Ethan had just announced he needed to spend 3 days at the ranch handling fence repairs. Doing what? Using the ranch as a shield, creating distance when things get difficult. The fences actually need repair, Margaret. That's not an excuse. I know they do, but you could hire someone to handle it, or you could take me with you and we could handle it together. Instead, you're choosing to go alone right after we had that disagreement about your mother's dishes. Ethan stopped packing his saddlebag. That disagreement, as you call it, was you telling me I need to let go of the past. I said you need to stop letting the past dictate your present. There's a difference. Is there? Because it felt like you were saying, my grief doesn't matter. Margaret's expression softened. That's not what I meant. Your grief matters. Your loss matters. But Ethan, you're still carrying those dishes around like they're the only connection you have to your family. Like if you let them go, you'll lose the memory too. Maybe I will. No, you won't, because the memory isn't in the dishes. It's in you. In the choices you make, the life you build, the way you love despite knowing love can be lost. She moved closer. But if you keep treating every object like it's sacred, every change like it's betrayal, you're going to spend your whole life in a museum of the past instead of living in the present. The words stung because they were true. Ethan had been holding on to his mother's dishes, his father's tools, every physical reminder of the family he'd lost, treating them like talismans that could protect him from experiencing that loss again. I don't know how to let go, he admitted quietly. I know, but maybe you don't have to let go completely. Maybe you just have to hold on differently. Use the dishes instead of storing them. Display the tools instead of hiding them. Let the past be part of your present instead of something you're trying to preserve perfectly. It was such a simple suggestion, but it cracked something open in Ethan's chest. He'd been treating his grief like it was fragile, like examining it too closely would shatter him. But Margaret was right. The real fragility was in refusing to engage with it honestly. Come with me, he said suddenly, to the ranch. Help me figure out what to keep and what to let go. Help me turn it into something that's ours instead of just mine. Margaret smiled. Now you're learning. They spent 3 days at the ranch together, and it was the first time Margaret had seen the full scope of what Ethan had built over 15 years. She walked the fence lines with him, examined the modest herd he'd kept after selling off the majority, explored the small cabin that had been his home for so long. It's lonelier than I expected, she said, standing in the cabin's main room. I thought it would feel peaceful, but it just feels empty. It was peaceful once, before I understood the difference between peace and isolation. They went through his possessions together, deciding what mattered and what didn't. Some things they kept. His mother's dishes, which they packed carefully to bring back to town. His father's best knife, which had genuine utility. A quilt his sister had made, which Margaret immediately claimed for their bed. Other things they sold or gave away. Duplicate tools, excess furniture, the defensive stockpile of supplies Ethan had accumulated like armor against an uncertain world. And some things they burned. Letters from people Ethan no longer remembered. Documents from legal disputes that no longer mattered. Physical remnants of a life built on fear rather than choice. Standing by the fire pit watching papers curl and blacken, Ethan felt something release. Not his grief, that would always be part of him, but the desperate need to control it, to preserve it perfectly, to let it define every choice he made. This feels significant, Margaret said softly. It is. I'm letting go of the man I thought I needed to be, making space for whoever I'm becoming. And who's that? Don't know yet. Still figuring it out. He took her hand. But I know I want you beside me while I do. They returned to town with a wagon full of carefully chosen possessions and a shared sense that something important had shifted. The ranch was still Ethan's responsibility, still part of his livelihood, but it was no longer his identity, no longer the fortress he retreated to when the world felt overwhelming. By August, they'd saved enough to rent a small house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. They moved in together, combining their possessions into a space that reflected both of them. Margaret's books lined shelves Ethan built. His mother's dishes held food Margaret cooked. The quilt his sister had made covered their shared bed. It was imperfect and crowded and absolutely right. In September, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told Ethan one evening while they were washing dishes together, a routine they'd developed where he washed and she dried and they talked about everything and nothing. "I'm going to have a baby." Ethan's hand stilled in the wash water. "You're certain?" "Dr. Winters confirmed it this afternoon, due in late April, early May." 1,000 thoughts crashed through Ethan's mind simultaneously, joy and terror in equal measure. The overwhelming responsibility of bringing a child into an uncertain world. The fear that he'd fail as a father the way he'd failed at so many other things. The absolute certainty that this tiny person he hadn't even met yet was already the most important thing in his life besides Margaret. "Ethan?" Margaret's voice was uncertain. "Say something." He turned to face her, his hands still dripping with dishwater, and saw the same mixture of emotions reflected in her expression. She was scared too, thrilled and terrified and completely unprepared despite all her education and confidence. "I don't know how to be a father," he said honestly. "I don't know how to be a mother. We're going to make so many mistakes." "Probably. But we'll make them together, and we'll be honest about them instead of pretending we have all the answers." Margaret took his wet hands in hers. "This is terrifying, Ethan, but it's also everything we've been choosing, building a life that's bigger than just survival, creating something that lasts beyond ourselves. What if I can't protect them? What if something happens and then we'll face it. Together. The same way we've faced everything else." She squeezed his hands. "But Ethan, you can't live in fear of potential loss. You can't let the possibility of tragedy prevent you from experiencing joy. That's not protection. That's just another kind of dying." She was right. She was always right about this. About the difference between caution and fear, between preparation and paralysis. Ethan pulled her close, mindful of the tiny life growing inside her, and made a conscious choice. Not to stop being afraid. Fear was natural, protective, human. But to not let that fear dictate every decision, to accept uncertainty as the price of living fully. "We're having a baby," he said, testing out the words. "We are. That's incredible." "It is. I love you, both of you." Margaret laughed, the sound bright with relief and joy. "We love you too." The pregnancy progressed through fall and into winter. Margaret continued teaching as long as she could, finally stepping back in February when her growing belly made it difficult to move between desks. The school board arranged for a temporary replacement, with the understanding that Margaret would return after the baby was old enough. Ethan adjusted the ranch's operations again, bringing the remaining cattle closer to town so he could check on them without being gone for days. He hired Billy part-time, the young man proving surprisingly capable and grateful for the steady work. It wasn't the perfectly independent operation Ethan had once envisioned, but it was sustainable. And sustainability, he'd learned, was more valuable than independence. In March, they had their first serious fight as a married couple. Not about small things. Those arguments had been frequent and relatively easy to resolve. This was about something deeper. Margaret wanted to name the baby after Ethan's mother if it was a girl. Ethan had refused, insisting they should choose a name that was entirely their own, not weighted with history and grief. "You're doing it again," Margaret said, her voice tight with frustration. "You're treating the past like it's contaminated, like honoring your mother somehow means we're trapped by what you lost." "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're still so scared of grief that you won't even speak your mother's name in connection with our daughter."
This story was posted on the
speak her
channel
name.
west of Betrayal.
When?
Please do not
When do you talk
repost
about
it
her,
in
about
any
your family,
form.
about anything that happened before you bought that ranch? Margaret was crying now, frustrated tears she wiped away angrily. "You've done so much work, Ethan. You've changed so much. But you're still keeping parts of yourself locked away. Still treating your past like it's something to survive rather than something that shaped you." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand." "Then make me understand. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about your sister. Tell me what you're so afraid of that you can't even consider honoring their memory." "I'm afraid that if I let them back in, if I really remember them, really feel what I lost, it'll destroy me all over again." The words burst out of him, raw and desperate. I'm afraid that the grief I've been controlling for 15 years will consume everything. That I'll lose you and this baby and the life we're building because I can't handle remembering what it felt like to watch them die." The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret crossed the room slowly, her pregnant belly making her movements careful. She took Ethan's face in her hands and made him look at her. "That grief isn't going to consume you. It already tried, and you survived. You survived 15 years of isolation, survived getting shot and trampled, survived learning how to love again despite every fear telling you it would destroy you." Her voice was fierce, certain. "And you know how I know you can handle remembering your family? Because you're already remembering them, every time you choose to be present instead of distant, every time you build instead of protecting, every time you love despite being afraid. That's their legacy. That's what they gave you." Ethan felt something break open inside him, some final wall he'd been maintaining between his past and his present. And for the first time in 15 years, he let himself really remember. Not just the deaths, not just the fever and the loss and the terrible helplessness, but the life before that. His mother's laugh, his sister's stubbornness, his father's quiet strength. The way they'd been as people, not just as victims of disease. He cried then, properly cried, for the first time since he was 17 years old. Margaret held him while he shook with 15 years of accumulated grief, while he finally mourned not just what he'd lost, but what they'd never gotten to be. His mother would have been 57 now. His sister would have been 30, maybe married, maybe with children of her own. His father might have lived another decade, might have met Margaret, might have held his grandchild. They were gone, really, truly gone, and no amount of preserving their dishes or avoiding their names would bring them back. But they didn't have to be erased either. They could be remembered, honored, integrated into the life Ethan was building instead of locked away in some untouchable past. When the storm of grief finally passed, Ethan pulled back, exhausted and raw and strangely lighter. "Her name was Elizabeth," he said quietly. "My mother. Everyone called her Betsy." "Elizabeth is a beautiful name." "It is." He put his hand on Margaret's belly, feeling their daughter move beneath his palm. "And if you want to use it, if you want our daughter to carry that name forward, I'd be honored." Margaret's smile was soft, understanding. "We'll think about it. Together, choose deliberately, the way we choose everything." They didn't end up naming her Elizabeth. When their daughter was born on a warm April evening with Dr. Winters presiding and Ethan nearly passing out from anxiety, they took one look at her furious red face and decided she needed a name that was entirely her own. They called her Sarah, strong and simple and carrying no weight except the future she'd build for herself. Holding his daughter for the first time, Ethan understood something fundamental about fear and love and the risk of living fully. Sarah was tiny, fragile, completely dependent. Anything could happen to her. Disease, accident, the 1,000 unpredictable tragedies that life could deliver without warning. And he couldn't protect her from any of it. Not really, not completely. But he could love her, could be present in her life, could teach her through example that living meant risking loss, that connection was worth vulnerability, that the only real failure was refusing to try. "She's perfect," Margaret whispered from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "She's terrifying." "That too," Margaret reached for his hand. "But we'll figure it out, together." "Together," Ethan agreed. The first year of Sarah's life was chaos, beautiful, exhausting, overwhelming chaos. Ethan learned to change diapers, to pace the floor at 3 a.m. when she wouldn't sleep, to feel his heart stop every time she coughed or seemed too quiet. Margaret returned to teaching part-time, and they juggled responsibilities with the kind of improvisation that would have terrified Ethan's younger self. But they managed. Not perfectly. They made mistakes constantly, disagreed about everything from feeding schedules to whether Sarah needed a heavier blanket. But they managed through honesty and adjustment, and the willingness to keep trying even when they felt completely overwhelmed. Billy took on more responsibility at the ranch, proving capable enough that Ethan began to consider making him a partner rather than just an employee. The herd stayed small but profitable, providing steady income that supplemented Margaret's teaching salary. They'd never be wealthy, but they were stable, secure in a way that had nothing to do with isolation and everything to do with community. On Sarah's first birthday, they held a gathering at their small house. Sam came, bringing toys he'd carved himself. Dutch was passing through on another cattle drive and stopped by with stories about the trail. Mrs. Chen brought food enough to feed 20 people despite only a dozen being present. Billy arrived with his new wife, a quiet girl from a neighboring ranch, who looked at him with the same mixture of love and exasperation Margaret often directed at Ethan. Standing in his crowded house with his daughter in his arms and his wife beside him, Ethan felt the full weight of what he'd built. Not a fortress against loss, not a guarantee against tragedy, but a life. Real, complicated, absolutely worth every risk. "You look thoughtful," Margaret observed. "Just thinking about how different everything is from what I expected." "Better or worse?" "Terrifyingly better." She laughed, the sound warm and familiar. "I'll take that." Sarah reached for Margaret and Ethan passed her over, watching his wife and daughter together. Margaret was teaching Sarah words, reading to her constantly, already preparing her for a world that would demand she think critically and choose deliberately. And Ethan was learning to let her, to not hover protectively, to not try to shield Sarah from every potential hurt, to trust that she'd develop her own strength through experience rather than through his control. That night, after everyone had left and Sarah was finally asleep, Ethan and Margaret sat together in the quiet house. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked. "Choosing this life? Choosing me?" "Never. Do you?" "Not once." He paused. "But I'm curious what you see when you look at me now, compared to who I was when we met." Margaret considered the question seriously. "When I first met you, I saw someone who'd survived but stopped living. Someone so focused on protecting himself that he'd forgotten what he was protecting himself for." She took his hand. "Now I see someone who's still scared. You'll probably always be scared, but who chooses to live anyway. Who shows up every day, makes mistakes, admits them, and keeps trying. That's who you are now. That's who you helped me become. No, that's who you chose to become. I just refused to let you settle for less." They sat in comfortable silence, and Ethan thought about the journey that had brought him here. From the ranch where he'd hidden for 15 years, to the runaway wagon that had shattered his isolation, to the months of learning to be present, to the cattle drive that had nearly killed him, to this moment, sitting in a house full of love with a woman who demanded he live honestly and a daughter who represented every terrifying possibility the future held. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 17 when fever had stolen his family. Wasn't the life he'd built at 22 when he'd bought land and convinced himself isolation was survival. But it was real. Honest. Built on choice rather than fear. 2 years later, Ethan stood at the edge of town watching new families arrive. The territory was growing, changing, evolving into something more settled and civilized. The schoolhouse had been expanded to accommodate more students. A proper doctor's office had been built to replace Dr. Winter's makeshift clinic. Plans were underway for a library, a town hall, maybe eventually a telegraph connection to the larger world. Martin Gaines had been right about one thing. The frontier was changing, but he'd been wrong about what that change meant. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't the death of strength and self-sufficiency. It was evolution. The recognition that community was more sustainable than isolation, that connection was more powerful than control, that building something together created more value than defending what you had alone. Margaret had been invited to sit on the school board, her opinions now valued rather than dismissed. Billy had bought a small piece of land adjacent to Ethan's ranch and was building his own operation with the skills Ethan had taught him. Sam was talking about running for territorial
This story was
representative,
posted on the
claiming
channel
someone
west
needed
of
to
Betrayal.
advocate for communities
Please do not
over
repost
corporations.
it in any
And
form.
Ethan was learning to be a father, a husband, a community member. Learning that you could be all those things and still be yourself. That vulnerability and strength weren't opposites, but partners. That the bravest thing a person could do was admit they needed others and accept help when it was offered. Sarah was 3 now, talking in full sentences and asking questions about everything. She had Margaret's sharp mind and Ethan's stubborn determination, and watching her navigate the world with fearless curiosity reminded Ethan daily why all of this mattered. "Papa, why are those people here?" Sarah asked, pointing at the new arrivals. "They're looking for a place to build a life, same as we did." Will they stay? Some will, some won't. Depends on what they're looking for. What were you looking for? Ethan glanced back at their house where Margaret was visible through the window, preparing supper. I thought I was looking for safety. Turned out I needed something else entirely. What? Someone brave enough to show me that hiding isn't the same as surviving. That living means risking loss. That love is worth being afraid. Sarah considered this with the seriousness only a 3-year-old could manage. Mama says you're brave. Mama's generous. She says you used to be scared, but you got braver. That's more accurate. I'm still scared, sweetheart. Just scared of different things now. Like what? Like not being the father and husband you and Mama deserve. Like making mistakes that hurt people I love. Like losing what matters most. But you do it anyway? Ethan smiled, picking up his daughter. I do it anyway. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is being so scared of losing that you never really have anything worth losing. Sarah wrapped her arms around his neck, and Ethan felt the familiar surge of overwhelming love and terror that fatherhood had brought into his life. This tiny person trusted him completely, depended on him for everything, would be shaped by his choices in ways he couldn't fully predict or control. It was the most terrifying responsibility he'd ever accepted. It was also the most meaningful. They walked back toward the house together, and Ethan thought about the man he'd been that October morning when a runaway wagon had changed everything. That man had believed love destroyed, that caring made you vulnerable, that the only survival was isolation. He'd been wrong about all of it. Love didn't destroy, fear did. Caring didn't make you vulnerable. Refusing to care made you hollow. And isolation wasn't survival. It was just slow death by degrees. Real survival meant choosing to live fully despite uncertainty, meant building connections knowing they could be broken, meant loving people knowing you could lose them, meant accepting that control was an illusion and the only real choice you had was whether to engage with life honestly or hide from it behind walls that couldn't actually protect you from anything that mattered. That evening, after Sarah was asleep and the house was quiet, Ethan and Margaret sat together on their small porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. What are you thinking about? Margaret asked. About how you whispered that I was too beautiful for you. Margaret laughed. I never said that. Not out loud, but I saw it in your eyes the first time you really looked at me, like you were surprised someone like me existed. I was surprised. You were so closed off, so determined to be alone. I couldn't understand why. She leaned against his shoulder. Took me months to realize you weren't choosing solitude. You were hiding from fear. And you couldn't let that stand. I couldn't watch another intelligent person destroy themselves with lies. Couldn't let you waste your life protecting a heart that had stopped beating. Ethan was quiet for a moment, absorbing those words the way he'd absorbed them the first time Margaret had said them. But now they carried different weight because his heart wasn't stopped anymore. It was beating fully, painfully, beautifully alive. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not giving up on me. For demanding I be honest even when it was easier to lie. For showing me that living means risking loss, and that's not weakness, that's courage. Margaret lifted her head to look at him. You did the work, Ethan. You made the choices. You changed yourself. I just refused to let you settle. You did more than that. You saved me. No, you saved yourself. You just needed someone to believe you were worth saving. They sat together as the light faded and the stars emerged, and Ethan felt the completeness of this moment. Not perfect. Nothing was ever perfect. But real, honest, built on deliberate choice rather than desperate fear. He'd spent 15 years convinced that survival meant isolation. Had built a fortress around his heart and called it strength. Had believed that caring about anything or anyone was inviting destruction. Margaret had proven him wrong about all of it, had shown him through patient, relentless honesty that real strength came from vulnerability. That survival wasn't enough. That a life worth living required risking everything you were afraid to lose. And now, sitting on this porch with his wife beside him and his daughter sleeping inside and a future stretching out before them full of uncertainty and possibility, Ethan Cole finally understood what it meant to choose life over fear. Not survival, but living. Really, fully, terrifyingly living. And it was worth every risk he'd ever taken. It was worth everything.